The year is 1997, and the world is heavier than it is today. It is a weight measured in physical objects, in things you have to carry, things you have to remember, things you have to touch. If you want to listen to music, you carry a case of plastic squares. If you want to take a photograph, you carry a mechanical box and a roll of chemical film. And if you want to watch a movie, you do not simply summon it from the air. You have to go out into the world, start a car, drive to a building, and negotiate for the temporary custody of a brick of black plastic. In the passenger seat of a dark sedan parked in a driveway in Santa Cruz, California, sat one of these bricks. It was a VHS cassette. To hold one was to hold a small, intricate machine. It had a specific rattle when you shook it, the sound of the spools knocking against the hard outer shell. It smelled faintly of static electricity and industrial lubricant. This particular cassette was housed in a white plastic rental case, the kind with the textured grip on the spine and the clear sleeve on the front where the cover art was slipped in. The cover showed the determined face of Tom Hanks, encased in a space helmet, staring out into the void. Apollo 13. Reed Hastings stared at the cassette. He was not looking at the movie, he was looking at a mistake. The car was silent. The engine had ticked cool, the metal contracting in the evening air. The streetlights of suburban California were just beginning to hum to life, casting long, amber shadows across the manicured lawns. It was a Tuesday, perhaps, or a Wednesday. One of those nondescript weekdays that blurred together in the life of a busy man. Reed was tired. It was the deep, bone-settling fatigue of a man who has spent years building a software company, selling it, and navigating the friction of corporate transition. He wanted to go inside, he wanted to eat dinner, he wanted to forget the day, but he couldn't leave the car, not yet, because he had found the tape. It had been hiding. It had slipped into that chaotic purgatory of lost objects. The space under the car seat, or perhaps buried beneath a pile of gym clothes in the trunk, or stacked innocently under a magazine on the coffee table. It had been missing for 6 weeks. In the timeline of a video rental, 6 weeks is an eternity. It is a geological era. A standard rental period was 3 days, maybe 5, if you were lucky or paid extra. After that, the clock began to tick. It was a silent, invisible clock, counting up the debt, hour by hour, day by day. Reed picked up the case. It felt cold in his hand. He ran his thumb over the edge of the plastic. He did the mental math, the arithmetic of negligence. The store charged a daily late fee. It was a punitive system, designed to slap the wrist of the forgetful. For 6 weeks, that fee had been accumulating, compounding, growing in the dark like a fungus. $40. The number sat in the air of the car, heavy and absurd. $40. In 1997, $40 was a significant amount of money for a trivial mistake. It was the price of a frantic grocery run. It was a tank of gas and a nice dinner. It was, most humiliatingly, significantly more than the price of simply buying the movie brand new. He had rented a story about men trapped in a tin can halfway to the moon, struggling to survive against the odds. And now he was trapped in a much smaller, much more mundane drama. He was a successful man, a man who understood complex systems, a man with resources. And yet, sitting there in the driveway, he felt a sharp, prickling flush of shame. It was the shame of a schoolboy who has forgotten his homework. It was the shame of being disorganized. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't just throw it away. The system knew who he was. His name, his address, his credit card number, they were all stored in the database of the blue and yellow fortress down the road. He had to go back. He had to walk in, face the clerk, admit his failure, and pay the ransom. Reed started the car. The engine coughed to life, breaking the suburban silence. He backed out of the driveway, the tires crunching softly on the asphalt. He wasn't going to the moon. He was going to Blockbuster. The drive was short, but it felt long. The radio played low, the tinny sound of late 90s alternative rock filling the cabin, but Reed wasn't listening. He was thinking about the nature of the transaction he was about to make. He was driving toward a monopoly. In 1997, Blockbuster Video was not just a store. It was a cultural institution. It was the town square of American entertainment. There were thousands of them, scattered across the continent like beacons. You could find one in nearly every strip mall, sandwiched between a supermarket and a dry cleaner. They were reliable, they were consistent, they were inevitable. As Reed turned the corner, the sign came into view. It was iconic. The torn ticket stub logo, glowing in bright, assertive blue and yellow. It was a lighthouse in the sea of retail. The light it cast was distinctive. a harsh, fluorescent wash that spilled out onto the sidewalk, illuminating the concrete and the parked cars. Even from the street, you could feel the energy of the place. It was Friday night every night inside a Blockbuster. He parked the car. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment, the plastic case of Apollo 13 resting on the passenger seat like an unwanted passenger. He took a breath, grabbed the tape, and stepped out into the night. The automatic doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss. Immediate sensory immersion. To walk into a Blockbuster in the late 90s was to step into a very specific, manufactured atmosphere. The air was always conditioned to a crisp chill, regardless of the weather outside. It smelled of ozone, industrial carpet cleaner, stale popcorn, and the faint, sweet chemical scent of thousands of plastic cases off-gassing on the shelves. The soundscape was a chaotic layer cake of noise. There was the low hum of the fluorescent tube lighting overhead, buzzing like a trapped insect. There were the televisions mounted in the corners, playing a loop of movie trailers, explosions, dramatic dialogue, sweeping orchestral scores, all competing with the in-store radio network playing top 40 hits. And underneath it all was the human noise, the murmur of couples arguing over what to watch, the shriek of children running toward the video game section, the beep-beep-beep of the barcode scanners at the front counter. Reed walked onto the blue carpet. It was thin and industrial, patterned with vague geometric shapes meant to hide stains. He moved through the aisles. The store was a labyrinth of choice. Rows and rows of white wire racks stood tall, holding the inventory. The new releases wall was the altar of the temple, lining the perimeter of the store. Here, the covers were repeated. Dozens of copies of the same hit movie faced out, creating a wallpaper of celebrity faces. Jerry Maguire, Twister, Independence Day. But Reed wasn't here to browse. He wasn't here to experience the joy of discovery, that tactile pleasure of walking the aisles, tilting your head to read the spines, picking up a box, turning it over to read the synopsis, weighing the promise of the film against the time you had to spend. That was the ritual for the innocent. Reed was here for the ritual of the guilty. He walked past the candy racks, the boxes of Raisinets and Snow Caps, the microwave popcorn bags stacked in precarious pyramids. He approached the front counter. The counter was a high barrier, separating the customers from the staff. Behind it stood the gatekeepers, teenagers and college students in blue polo shirts and khaki pants. They looked tired. They had been on their feet for hours, scanning, sorting, restocking, and dealing with the friction of the public. Reed waited in line. The person in front of him was arguing about a membership card. The minutes stretched. He held the Apollo 13 case tighter. He wanted to explain, preemptively, that he hadn't watched the movie for 6 weeks, that he hadn't even liked it that much, that it was just an accident of physics. The tape had slid under the seat, and out of sight meant out of mind. But the system didn't care about physics. It didn't care about intent. It cared about the calendar. Finally, it was his turn. He stepped up to the register. The clerk, a young man with a name tag that was slightly crooked, looked up. He didn't smile, but he didn't frown. He just extended a hand. Reed placed the cassette on the counter. "Returning?" the clerk asked, his voice flat. "Yes," Reed said. It's a little late." The clerk picked up the case. He opened it, checking to make sure the tape was inside and that it had been rewound. This was another rule of the era. Be kind. Rewind. If you returned to tape without winding the magnetic ribbon back to the start, there was a fee for that too. A small fee, but another prick of the needle. The clerk scanned the barcode on the spine. Beep! He looked at the screen. He typed something. He looked at the screen again. His eyebrows went up slightly. Not in surprise, really, but in mild recognition of a high score. "Okay," the clerk said. "That's going to be $40. He said it casually. He said it as if he were asking for 40 cents. To him, it was just a number on a screen. He didn't set the prices. He just collected them. Reed felt the flush in his cheeks again. He reached for his wallet. He didn't argue. There was no point in arguing. The computer was right. The policy was clear. He had signed the contract when he got his membership card, that laminated piece of plastic that promised entertainment but delivered an obligation. He pulled out his credit card, the swipe, the receipt printing with a jagged, tearing sound. "Do you want to rent anything else tonight?" the clerk asked, the upsell automatic, a reflex programmed by corporate training. Reed looked at the wall of movies behind the clerk, thousands of stories. Thousands of hours of emotion, adventure, romance, and fear, all trapped in plastic, all waiting to be borrowed. No, Reed said, not tonight. He walked out of the store. The sliding doors hissed shut behind him, sealing in the noise and the light and the smell of popcorn. Outside, the air was cool and clean. The parking lot was darker now. Reed walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat, but he didn't start the engine immediately. He felt lighter in the sense that the burden of the lost tape was gone. But he also felt an emptiness in his wallet and a profound sense of irritation in his mind. It wasn't the money. Well, it was the money, but it wasn't just the money. It was the principle of the exchange. He thought about the transaction he had just completed. He had paid $40 for absolutely nothing. He hadn't bought a product. He hadn't received a service. He had simply paid a penalty for being human. He had paid for being busy, for being forgetful, for having a life that didn't perfectly align with the rigid schedule of a video rental corporation. The business model of Blockbuster, he realized in that quiet car, was predicated on customer failure. They didn't just make money when you watched a movie. They made money when you messed up. They profited from your guilt. A significant portion of their revenue, millions and millions of dollars, came from late fees. They were betting against their own customers. They were banking on the fact that you would be tired, that you would leave the tape on top of the TV, that you would forget to drive to the store on your way home from work. It felt adversarial. It felt like a trap. Reed looked out the windshield at the glowing blue sign. It looked arrogant now. It looked predatory. He thought about his gym. He had joined a gym recently. He paid a monthly fee, $30 or $40 a month. For that fee, he could go as much as he wanted, or he could not go at all. If he went every day, the price was the same. If he didn't go for a month, the price was the same. The gym didn't charge him extra for not showing up. They didn't punish him for being busy. The gym model was about access. The video store model was about possession. Why were movies treated like library books? Why was there a due date? Why did the clock have to tick so loudly? The questions swirled in his mind, unstructured and fluid. He wasn't thinking about starting a company. He wasn't thinking about streaming or the internet or the future of global entertainment. He was just a guy who felt ripped off. He started the car. He pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the blue and yellow glow behind him in the rearview mirror. As he drove home, the seed began to settle. It was a tiny thing, hard and cold like a pebble in a shoe. It wasn't a fully formed plan. It was just a rejection of the status quo. It was the stubborn thought that there had to be a better way to do this. The world of 1997 was built on atoms. It was built on the movement of physical goods. To get a movie to a person, you had to manufacture a plastic box, ship it to a warehouse, ship it to a store, put it on a shelf, and wait for the person to come and get it. Then the person had to take it home, watch it, and bring it back. It was a loop of enormous friction. Reed didn't know it yet, but he had just walked out of the past. The road ahead was dark, illuminated only by the cones of his headlights cutting through the night. He turned the radio up slightly. The static was gone. He drove toward his house, toward the future, leaving the $40 receipt crumpled in his pocket, a receipt that would eventually become the most expensive piece of paper in the history of the entertainment industry. The tape was returned, the debt was paid, but the grievance remained. And in the fertile soil of Reed Hastings, frustration, something was beginning to stir. The car turned into his driveway. The house was quiet. He turned off the engine. The silence returned, absolute and heavy. He sat there for one more moment, listening to the cooling metal, looking at the empty passenger seat where the cassette had been. It was gone, but the weight of it was still there. And somewhere in the distance, in the unseen networks of the world, the first faint pulses of a new era were waiting to be born. But for now, there was just a man, a car, and a lingering sense that the world was wrong. Chapter 2. A Disc in the Wind. The sun in Santa Cruz has a different quality than the sun in Silicon Valley. Over the hill, in the sprawl of Palo Alto and Mountain View, the light seems to filter through a haze of ambition and exhaust, bouncing off the glass facades of office parks where the future is being written in lines of code. But here, on the coast, the light is oceanic. It is softened by salt and mist. It carries a golden, lazy weight, illuminating the surf shops, the boardwalk, and the quiet tree-lined streets where the day seems to move at the speed of the tide. It was into this golden light that Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph stepped, leaving the shadows of a coffee shop, their minds buzzing with a problem that had no shape. If the first chapter of this story was defined by a heavy black brick of plastic, the VHS cassette, then this chapter is defined by something far more ethereal, something light enough to catch the wind. The year was still 1997. The digital revolution was a rumble in the distance, a storm on the horizon that everyone knew was coming, but few had felt the rain of yet. Reed and Mark were in a transition period. They were commuters in the truest sense, not just driving between home and work, but driving between eras. They spent their mornings in a car, a Toyota Avalon, winding their way over Highway 17, the treacherous, serpentine road that connects the sleepy beach town to the frenetic energy of the tech world. Those car rides were their incubator. Locked in the cabin, moving through the redwood forests where the sunlight shattered through the canopy, they pitched ideas to each other. Bad ideas. Impossible ideas. Customized dog food. Personalized shampoo. Surfboard rentals. They were throwing stones into a dark well, waiting to hear a splash. But the frustration of the late fee, the lingering resentment of the blockbuster transaction, had stayed with Reed. It was a grit in the gears of his mind. He couldn't let go of the video store. The model was flawed. It was hostile. But the logistics of changing it seemed insurmountable. The problem was mass. A VHS tape is a substantial object. It has heft. It has moving parts. To ship a VHS tape back and forth through the mail, to bypass the store entirely, was economically impossible. The postage alone would cost more than the rental fee. The tape was too heavy, too bulky. It required a box. It required padding. It was an anchor, dragging down any dream of a home delivery rental service. But technology has a way of dissolving mass. Reed and Mark were walking down the sidewalk in downtown Santa Cruz. The air smelled of roasted coffee beans and the distant, brine-soaked scent of the Pacific. They were talking about a new format, a whisper in the industry that had barely reached the consumer market. The digital versatile disc. The DVD. In 1997, the DVD was a rumor to most people. It was a piece of science fiction. It promised to hold an entire movie, with better picture and sound than a tape, on a shiny platter no bigger than a coaster. It was thin. It was light. It was a miracle of compression. But it was also fragile. That was the hesitation. A VHS tape was a tank. You could drop it, step on it, leave it in a hot car, and it would usually still play. It was a rugged survivor of the physical world. A disc, however, was a jewel. It was an exposed surface of data. A single, deep scratch, a crack, a warp from the heat, and the movie was gone. It was a format designed for careful handling, for jewel cases, for the gentle grip of a machine. The question that hung between Reed and Mark that afternoon was not about software. It wasn't about websites or algorithms. It was a question of physics and violence. Could a naked optical disc survive the brutal industrial machinery of the United States Postal Service? They decided to find out immediately. They didn't have a DVD. Hardly anyone did. The format was so new that you couldn't just walk into a store and buy a movie on disc. But the physical dimensions of a DVD were identical to those of a music CD. And music CDs were everywhere. They walked into a local record store. The aisles were packed with the cultural artifacts of the late 90s. Rows of compact discs in their hard, brittle plastic jewel cases. Reed and Mark didn't care about the music. They weren't looking for a specific artist. They were looking for a stunt double. They bought a used CD. Some accounts say it was a Patsy Cline compilation. Others say it was something forgettable and random. It didn't matter. The music was irrelevant. The plastic was the point. They stripped the disc from its protective jewel case. Now they held it in their hands. A raw, shimmering circle. It felt impossibly light. It weighed less than an ounce. It was flimsy. It felt like something that shouldn't be mailed. Next, they needed a vehicle. They walked down the street to a gift shop, a place that sold scented candles and greeting cards. The contrast was stark. They were two technology executives plotting the overthrow of a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they were standing in a card aisle surrounded by pastel envelopes and get-well-soon messages. They bought a single greeting card. It was a standard size, perhaps a pale blue or a soft cream color. They also bought an envelope. They stepped out onto the sidewalk. The experiment was ready to be assembled. Reed held the envelope open. Mark slid the naked disc inside. There was no bubble wrap, no cardboard stiffener, no do not bend stamp. It was just the disc, loose inside the paper sleeve, sliding around with a dry, whispery sound. It felt wrong. It felt like putting a china plate in a rucksack. The disc created a subtle bulge in the envelope, a rigid circle in the center of the paper rectangle. Anyone touching it would know exactly what was inside. They sealed the envelope. Reed licked the gummed strip. The taste of cheap adhesive, a small, sensory detail in a moment of high stakes. He pressed it shut. Now came the address. They borrowed a pen. Reed wrote his own home address on the front. He lived nearby, just a town over. It was a short journey, but it would be a violent one. To get from this sidewalk to Reed's mailbox, the envelope would not simply be carried. It would be inducted into a massive, automated system. It would be tossed into a canvas bag. It would be thrown onto a truck. It would be dumped onto a conveyor belt. And, most terrifyingly, it would be fed into the high-speed sorting machines. These machines were legendary for their hunger. They used rollers and belts to whip letters around corners at incredible speeds. They bent envelopes to read the zip codes. They compressed them. They were designed for paper, flexible, foldable paper. They were not designed for rigid polycarbonate discs. If the machine tried to bend the envelope around a roller, the disc would snap. It would arrive at Reed's house as a bag of plastic shards. They walked to the post office. It was a brick building, solid and imposing, flying the flag. The blue metal collection boxes stood outside like sentries. Reed stood before the box. He held the envelope. It was such a small thing, a 32-cent stamp in the corner, a hand-scrawled address. Inside, the potential for a revolution. If this worked, the economics of the video rental business would collapse. If you could mail a movie for the price of a postage stamp, you didn't need stores. You didn't need thousands of employees. You didn't need real estate. You could put the entire inventory of the world in a warehouse in the middle of nowhere and ship it directly to the customer's hand. If it broke, the idea was dead. The cost of protective packaging would be too high. The logistics would be too complex. They would have to go back to the car, back to the drawing board, back to custom dog food. Reed looked at Mark. Mark nodded. It was a silent agreement to let fate decide. Reed extended his hand. He pushed the envelope through the dark, hinged slot of the mailbox. Clack. The sound of the metal door swinging shut was final. The envelope dropped into the darkness of the box, joining the bills, the love letters, and the junk mail. It was gone. It had entered the stream. They walked away. There was nothing left to do but wait. The wait is a unique form of torture for the innovator. In the digital age, we are accustomed to instant feedback. You press a key, and the code compiles. You send an email, and it arrives. You post a photo, and the likes appear. But this was the analog world. This was the world of atoms. Once you released an object, you lost all contact with it. You couldn't track it. You couldn't ping it. You just had to trust the system. That night, the envelope was moving. We can imagine its journey. The mail carrier arriving at the blue box, unlocking the bottom, sweeping the contents into a tub, the tub being tossed into the back of a Grumman LLV mail truck. The vibration of the engine, the bumps of the potholes, the envelope sliding against other letters, the disc rattling softly inside its paper skin. Then, the sorting facility, a cavernous warehouse filled with the roar of machinery, the smell of dust and paper dust. The envelope being dumped onto a belt, a river of white paper flowing fast. The scanners flashing red light, the belts whirring. The envelope hitting the diverters, being slapped and guided into the correct bin. The disc rigid and unyielding, fighting against the flexibility of the paper, surviving the turns, surviving the drops. Reed went home. He ate dinner. He slept. But the question remained in the back of his mind. Was it broken? Was it dust? The next morning, the sun rose again over Santa Cruz. The fog rolled in, cool and gray, hugging the coastline before burning off in the mid-morning heat. Reed waited for the mail. The arrival of the mail is a ritual that has lost some of its potency in the modern era, but in 1997 it was still the primary rhythm of the day. The sound of the mail truck, the distinct, high-pitched whine of its engine, was a signal. Reed heard the truck. He heard the stop. He heard the footsteps on the path. He heard the click of the mailbox lid. He waited a beat, letting the carrier drive away. Then he walked out to the street. The air was fresh. The neighborhood was quiet. He opened the mailbox. There was a small pile of mail. He sifted through it, a bill, a catalog. And there, at the bottom, was the greeting card envelope. It looked weary. The pristine paper was smudged with the black grease of the sorting machines. The corners were slightly dogged. It bore the postmark, a circular stamp of ink proving it had traveled through the belly of the beast and survived. Reed pulled it out. He held it in his hand. He felt the center. The disc was still there. It felt solid. It hadn't shattered into a loose bag of gravel. He walked back into the house, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of anticipation. He didn't rip it open immediately. He took it to the kitchen counter. He wanted to be precise. He tore the edge of the envelope. The paper gave way. He reached in and pulled out the disc. He held it up to the light. The surface was a rainbow of diffraction, the data layer gleaming under the kitchen lights. He turned it over. He tilted it left and right, looking for the spiderweb fractures, the hairline cracks that would render it useless. It was perfect. There were smudges, yes. Fingerprints. Maybe a microscopic scuff from the paper fibers. But the structure was intact. The disc had survived the sorters. It had survived the trucks. It had survived the drop. Reed smiled. It was a quiet smile, not a shout of victory. It was the smile of an engineer who has just verified a hypothesis. The physics worked. The barrier to entry, the massive overhead of the video store, the heavy brick of the VHS tape, the friction of the physical world had just evaporated. A movie wasn't a brick anymore. It was a letter. It could fly. It could slip under a door. It could travel anywhere in the country for 32 cents. He called Mark. It arrived, Reed said. And? Mark asked. It's fine, it plays. Or at least it would have played, had they bothered to put it in a CD player. The visual inspection was enough. So, Mark said, the realization settling in over the phone line, we can do this. We can do this, Reed replied. This was the moment the ground shifted. It wasn't a boardroom handshake or a venture capital check that launched the company. It was this, a dirty envelope on a kitchen counter in Santa Cruz. But knowing it was possible was different from making it real. They had proven the physics, but they hadn't proven the business. They had a delivery mechanism, but they didn't have a library. They didn't have a website. They didn't have a name. All they had was a disc and a dream. And now, the real work would begin. The romantic phase of the car rides and the coffee shops was over. Now they had to build the machine. They had to leave the sunlight of Santa Cruz and enter the chaos of the startup. They had to find a garage. They had to find money. They had to convince the world to trust them with their credit cards and their movie nights. The envelope had returned, but the journey was just beginning. Reed set the disc down on the counter. It sat there, a shiny, alien object in a domestic world, the first snowflake of the avalanche. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the eucalyptus trees, blowing the mist back out to sea. The world went on, unaware that the way it consumed stories had just changed forever. The Blockbuster down the street was just opening its doors for the day, the clerks turning on the fluorescent lights, stocking the shelves with heavy black tapes, unaware that their obsolescence was currently sitting on a kitchen counter a few miles away. The ghost had entered the machine. Chapter 3, The Chaos of the Garage. The dream of the digital age is often depicted as clean. We imagine pristine server rooms, white minimalism, and the silent, frictionless flow of data through fiber optic cables. We imagine that the companies which built the internet were born in laboratories of glass and steel, orchestrated by men in suits who knew exactly where they were going. But the reality of 1998 was not clean. It was messy, it was loud, and above all, it was hot. The story moves now from the cool, salt-air conceptualism of Santa Cruz to the stifling interior of an office in Scotts Valley. It wasn't a garage in the architectural sense, the mythological birthplace of Silicon Valley legends, but it carried the spiritual weight of a garage. It was a repurposed space, a former bank building that felt too small the moment they walked into it. It had industrial carpeting that seemed to trap the heat and fluorescent lights that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. This was the engine room of the idea. If the envelope experiment was the spark, this was the fire, and fires by their nature are chaotic. The room was filled with the smell of strained electronics. It is a specific scent, distinct to the late 90s. The smell of hot plastic, ozone, dust burning on cooling fans, and the underlying human scent of anxiety and stale coffee. Here, a motley crew of believers had gathered. They were not yet titans of industry. They were exhausted engineers and dreamers, wearing baggy jeans and t-shirts, their eyes rimmed with red, their skin pallid from a lack of sunlight. They were building a castle, but they were building it out of sand, and the tide was always coming in. The center of this chaotic solar system was the inventory. In 1998, the DVD was still a ghost. It was a format that barely existed. To launch a video store, you needed videos. But you couldn't just call a distributor and order 10,000 copies of the latest blockbuster, because they didn't exist yet. The studios were cautious. They were trickling movies out, testing the waters. So the acquisition of the library became a scavenger hunt. We can visualize Mark Randolph, the heart of the operation, standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by towers of plastic. They had to buy every single DVD in print. Not just the good movies. Every movie. There were fewer than 1,000 titles available in the entire world. To claim they had the world's largest library of DVDs, they simply had to buy one of everything. It was an absurd collection. Alongside Twister and GoldenEye sat obscure documentaries, terrible B-movies, and instructional videos on how to play piano. It didn't matter. They were circular, they were digital, and they fit in the envelope. The physical reality of the discs was a logistical nightmare. In a modern warehouse, robots glide silently along tracks, plucking items with pneumatic precision. In the Scotts Valley office, the robots were people. The discs arrived in bulk, encased in their retail packaging, the heavy plastic keep cases that were designed to look good on a blockbuster shelf. But Netflix, though it wasn't quite Netflix yet in the public mind, didn't mail the cases. They only mailed the discs. This meant that thousands of cases had to be opened. Thousands of paper inserts had to be removed. Thousands of discs had to be popped off their plastic hubs. Click, 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 and transferred into paper sleeves. The sound of the office was the sound of plastic snapping. It was a rhythmic, manual labor that felt at odds with the high-tech promise of the internet. It was a cottage industry disguised as a dot-com. Piles of discarded plastic cases grew in the corners like snowdrifts. The team was drowning in the physical detritus of the old world while trying to build the new one. They were sorting by hand, labeling by hand, stuffing envelopes by hand. And then there was the noise of the connection. The internet of the late 90s was not a silent stream. It was a screeching banshee. The air was filled with the handshake of modems, that jagged, rising and falling electronic scream that signaled a computer was trying to talk to the world. Bedoop, ks, gurgle. It was the soundtrack of the era. The servers that powered the website were not in a remote cloud farm in the desert. They were right there, in the room, or in a closet down the hall. They were beige towers, stacked on metal racks, their fans whirring desperately to dissipate the heat generated by the code. The code was fragile. The website, the storefront where customers would eventually browse this library of nearly 1,000 films, was being stitched together in real time. Reed Hastings moved through this chaos like a shark in a coral reef. He was the analytical engine. While Mark managed the culture and the vision, Reed was obsessed with the math. He was looking at the burn rate. He was looking at the cost of customer acquisition. He was looking at the terrifying reality that they were spending money they didn't really have on a market that didn't really exist. Because that was the great unspoken fear hanging over the room like a storm cloud. Nobody had DVD players. To launch a business based on renting DVDs in 1998 was like launching a gas station in 1905. The cars weren't there yet. The players were expensive, $500, sometimes $1,000. They were toys for the rich and the tech-obsessed. The average family in Ohio, the target demographic, was perfectly happy with their VCR. The team was betting their careers on the assumption that the world would change, and that it would change fast. The atmosphere in the office was a strange cocktail of manic optimism and existential dread. This was the height of the dot-com bubble. Money was cheap. Ideas were currency. If you had a website and a dot-com suffix, you could raise millions. But everyone knew deep down that the bubble was thin. There was a sense of vertigo, a feeling that they were all running off a cliff, hoping to build an airplane on the way down. There were nights when the code wouldn't compile, nights when the database crashed, erasing the virtual shelves they had just built. The engineers would slump over their keyboards, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and cans of Jolt Cola, the blue light of the CRT monitors washing out their exhausted faces. There is a specific kind of fatigue that comes from startup life. It is not the physical tiredness of a day in the fields. It is a mental fraying. It is the feeling of your mind constantly revving, solving problems in your sleep, waking up with the solution to a database query on your lips. In the Scotts Valley office, time seemed to dissolve. Day and night merged into a continuous gray smear of work. The windows were often covered or ignored. The only clock that mattered was the one counting down to the launch. They had decided on a date, April 14th, 1998. As the day approached, the tension in the room thickened. The air grew heavy. The playful banter, the Nerf gunfights, the jokes about the terrible movies they were stocking began to fade, replaced by the curt, clipped language of crisis management. They were building a machine that had to work perfectly the first time. If a customer came to the site and it crashed, they would never come back. If a customer rented a movie and the wrong disc arrived, the trust was broken. The complexity was hidden. To the customer, it had to look simple, a list of movies, a button that said rent. But behind that button was a Rube Goldberg machine of manual processes. When a user clicked rent, a printer in the office would have to spit out a label. A human being would have to grab that label, walk to the shelf, find the disc, stuff it in an envelope, peel the sticker, and toss it in a bin. It was a digital facade over an analog reality. One evening, late, the power flickered. The hum of the computers faltered for a second, and the collective heart of the room stopped. In that second of silence, you could hear the fragility of it all. If the power went out, the store vanished. If the servers died, the company was just a room full of plastic discs that nobody could watch. The lights buzzed back on. The fans spun up. The breath was released. Mark Randolph walked the rows of desks. He was the emotional anchor. He checked in on the developers, the content team, the people writing the synopsis for the movies. He knew that they were asking the impossible. They were asking these people to believe in a future that looked, frankly, ridiculous. Why would anyone do this, a skeptic might ask. Blockbuster is down the street. I can get a movie tonight. Why would I wait 3 days for the mail? It was a valid question. It was the question that kept them up at night. The only answer they had was the one Reed had felt in his car, the hatred of the late fee, the desire for a different relationship with entertainment. But was that enough? The office was a shrine to uncertainty. On the walls, they had taped up charts and flows, sketching out the logic of the rental queue. They were inventing the language of e-commerce as they went. The concept of a queue, a list of movies you wanted to watch in the future, was a radical invention. In a video store, you only cared about what was on the shelf right now. You didn't make a list for next month. But here, in the abstract space of the internet, they could let people dream. They could let people build a library of desire. The night before the launch, the room was vibrating. The cleaning crews had come and gone, ignored by the engineers still fixing last-minute bugs. The coffee pot was a burnt stain of black sludge. They weren't ready. You are never ready. The website, which they had named Netflix after discarding dozens of other names, Luna, Kibble, Replay, was sitting on the staging server, waiting to be pushed to the live web. It looked primitive by modern standards. It was a grid of text and small, pixelated images. But it was functional. It was a store that never closed, a store with no walls. Reed and Mark stood together, looking at a monitor. The chaos of the garage had led to this single, glowing rectangle. All the arguments, the long drives over Highway 17, the envelope tests, the sorting of thousands of plastic cases, it all compressed into this digital portal. "It's going to work," Mark said, though he couldn't possibly know. "It has to," Reed replied. The sun began to rise over the Santa Cruz Mountains, casting a pale, washed-out light through the office blinds. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the tangled snakes of Ethernet cables on the floor, and the slumped forms of sleeping engineers in beanbag chairs. It was morning. The chaos had settled into a stillness. They were about to turn the key. They were about to open the doors to a store that existed everywhere and nowhere. The garage phase was ending. The world was about to be invited in. And as the first rays of light hit the server rack, the fans seemed to spin a little louder, a mechanical inhalation before the scream. The website went live. The signal went out. And then they waited for the first click. The room was silent, save for the hum. They were fishermen who had cast a net into a dark, unknown ocean, waiting to see if anything swam in the deep. The wait wasn't long, but it felt like a lifetime. The cursor blinked, the log scrolled. And then, somewhere out there in the vast, wired world, a stranger found them. A connection was made, a request was sent. The printer in the corner whirred to life. ZZZZTZZZZT. It spit out a single piece of paper, a shipping label. Someone wanted a movie. The chaos of the garage had produced its first tangible result, a single sheet of paper that said, "We are in business." But the story of the startup isn't just about the first sale, it's about the avalanche that follows. Because as that printer finished its job, another request came, and then another. The silence of the morning was about to be broken by the roar of a demand they had hoped for, but were entirely unprepared to meet. The garage was about to get very, very small. Chapter 4. The Subscription Epiphany. The silence of a house at night is different when there is a debt inside it. It is a subtle frequency, a low-level hum of anxiety that exists on the periphery of consciousness. In 1999, millions of American homes contained this frequency. It emanated from the top of television sets, from coffee tables, and from the passenger seats of cars. It was the presence of the rented movie. The movie was not yours. It was a visitor, and it was a visitor with a curfew. Even after the launch of Netflix, even after the website went live and the first discs were shipped from the chaos of the Scotts Valley office, this fundamental anxiety remained. The company was open for business, yes, but the business was merely a digital mirror of the physical world. You went online, you picked a movie, you paid $4. You paid $2 for shipping, the movie arrived, and then the clock started ticking. If you didn't mail it back by the due date, the fees accrued. The model was still adversarial. The relationship between the merchant and the customer was still defined by a deadline. The red envelope was not yet a symbol of freedom. It was just a slower way to rent a movie. The initial excitement of the launch had settled into a grinding reality. The numbers were okay, but they weren't revolutionary. People would try the service, rent a DVD to see if the technology worked, and then they would vanish. They went back to the blue and yellow store down the street. Why wait 3 days for a movie you have to return in 3 days? The friction was too high. The reward was too low. Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph sat in the office, looking at the data. The data told a story of indifference. They had built a marvel of logistics, a machine that could move plastic across the continent, but they hadn't changed the feeling of the transaction. They were still selling a commodity. They weren't selling an experience. They needed to break the clock. The idea, when it came, was not a lightning bolt from the blue, but a gradual erosion of the old way of thinking. It was born from the same frustration that had started it all, the hatred of the punishment. What if there were no due dates? The sentence hangs in the air, simple and radical. In the context of the video rental industry, it was heresy. It was financial suicide. The entire economic structure of renting things, whether it's cars, tuxedos, or movies, is based on time. You pay for the time you use. If you keep it longer, you pay more. To remove the element of time was to remove the foundation of the profit model. But they went further. What if there were no late fees? What if you could keep the movie for a day, a week, a month, or a year? What if the movie simply sat in your house until you were ready to watch it? And finally, the third pillar of the epiphany, the subscription. The gym model, the flat fee. You pay once a month, and the world of cinema opens up to you. No transaction costs, no deciding if The Big Lebowski is worth $4. You just click, and it comes. They called it the Marquee program at first, but the world would come to know it simply as the Netflix subscription. The transition was terrifying. They were risking the little revenue they had on a psychological bet. The bet was this: if we treat people like adults, if we give them freedom, they won't abuse it. They won't steal the discs. They won't hoard them forever. They will watch, return, and want more. Let us shift our gaze now from the boardroom to the mailbox. It is a gray Tuesday in a suburb of Chicago. The sky is the color of wet wool. A cold drizzle is falling, misting the windshields of the parked cars. A woman walks down her driveway. She is tired. The workday is over, but the evening shift of domestic life is just beginning. Dinner needs to be cooked. Laundry needs to be folded. The mental load is heavy. She reaches the mailbox at the end of the drive. It is a metal tunnel, cold and damp. She reaches in and pulls out the stack of mail. It is the usual debris of adult life. A utility bill, white and crisp, demanding payment. A credit card offer, glossy and deceptive. A flyer for a local pizza place. A catalog for garden supplies she doesn't need. It is a stack of white and gray paper, a physical manifestation of chores and obligations. But in the middle of the stack there is a flash of color. Red. Not a subtle maroon, not a faded pink, but a bright, assertive fire engine red. It is a small rectangular envelope, distinct and vibrant against the gray backdrop of the afternoon. She pulls it out. It feels different than the other mail. It is heavier. There is a rigidity to it. It doesn't bend like the bills. It holds a secret inside. This is the red envelope. In this moment, the envelope is not just packaging. It is a dopamine trigger. It is the only thing in her hand that does not want something from her. The bill wants her money. The flyer wants her attention. The catalog wants her desire. But the red envelope, it brings a gift. It brings a story. She walks back up the driveway, shielding the mail from the rain. The red square is a beacon. She enters the house, the warmth of the furnace wrapping around her. She puts the bills on the counter to be dealt with later, a source of low-level dread. She throws the flyers in the trash. But the red envelope remains in her hand. She tears the perforated strip. Zip, a satisfying, clean sound. She opens the flap and slides out the white paper sleeve, and there it is, the disc, The Matrix. Or perhaps Shakespeare in Love. It doesn't matter what the movie is. What matters is that it is here. She places it on the coffee table. And this is where the revolution happens. In the old world, the placement of the movie on the table started the timer. The movie was a ticking bomb. "You must watch me tonight," the plastic box whispered. "If you are too tired, if the kids don't sleep, if you have a headache, too bad, watch me or pay." But this disc, it is silent, it is patient. It sits on the coffee table like a loyal dog waiting for its master. It says, "I am here whenever you are ready." If you want to watch me tonight, wonderful. If you want to watch me next Tuesday, that is fine too. I am not going anywhere. I will not punish you. The woman looks at the disc. She smiles. She feels a profound sense of relief, though she might not be able to articulate why. The pressure is gone. The entertainment is on her terms. The control has shifted from the corporation to the consumer. She goes about her evening. She cooks dinner. She helps with homework. The disc waits. 3 days later, on a Friday night, when the house is finally quiet and the week is done, she picks it up. She slides it into the player. She watches the movie. She enjoys it, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The next morning, she puts the disc back in the prepaid envelope, she seals it, she walks it out to the mailbox and raises the little red flag. The cycle is complete, but it is not over. Because she knows, with a certainty that feels like magic, that as soon as this red envelope vanishes into the postal system, another one is already being prepared. Her queue, that list of desires she built on the website, is moving. The system has seen the return. The system is pulling the next title. The Sixth Sense. It is already being picked from a bin in a warehouse. It is already being stuffed. It is already moving toward her. There is a rhythm to it, a heartbeat. Watch, return, receive. Watch, return, receive. It is a continuous flow of stories, entering and leaving her home like the tide. Back in the offices, the team watched this behavior emerge with a mixture of awe and relief. They had feared that people would sit on the movies for months, paralyzing the inventory, and some did. There were discs that lived on coffee tables for half a year, gathering dust. But for the most part, the opposite happened. When you remove the deadline, you paradoxically increase the consumption. The customers realized that the faster they returned the movie, the faster they got the next one. They weren't racing against a penalty, they were racing toward a reward. The all-you-can-eat model turned the passive act of renting into an active game of maximization. If I watch this tonight and mail it tomorrow, I can get the next one by Wednesday. The velocity of the discs increased. The red envelopes began to flood the postal system. They became a cultural signifier. You would see them on your neighbor's kitchen counter and nod, a secret handshake of the early adopters. You would see them sticking out of mailboxes down the street. It was a viral marketing campaign that cost nothing but the price of the paper. The color red was conquering the white landscape of the suburbs. The psychology of the subscription also changed the way people chose movies. When you have to pay $4 for a single rental, you are conservative. You bet on the sure thing. You rent the big action movie, the star-studded comedy. You don't take risks on a black and white foreign film or a quiet indie drama. The cost of a bad choice is too high. You feel cheated if the movie is bad. But under the subscription model, the marginal cost of a movie is zero. You have already paid your monthly fee. Whether you watch 5 movies or 10, the price is the same. This liberated the user's taste. Suddenly, people were willing to experiment. Why not try that documentary about penguins? Why not try that Japanese animation? If I don't like it, I'll just put it back in the envelope and get the next one. There was no buyer's remorse. There was only discovery. This was the Cinematch effect, the beginning of the algorithm's power, but it was rooted in the financial freedom of the subscription. The library began to move. The obscure titles, the dusty corners of the warehouse, began to circulate. The long tail of cinema was waking up. The atmosphere in the company changed. The frantic, day-to-day survival mode shifted into a focused, intense growth. They weren't just a store anymore. They were a utility. They were becoming as essential to the household as electricity or water. They were the pipe through which culture flowed. But the shift wasn't just about efficiency. It was about intimacy. The red envelope felt personal. It was addressed to you. It contained a story you had chosen. Opening it felt like opening a letter from a friend, even if that friend was a database in California. There is a specific sensory memory for those who lived through this era. The sound of the rip, the smell of the paper sleeve, the look of the disc, and the white rectangular flap of the return envelope which you had to be careful not to tear because you needed it to send the movie back. It was a ritual. In a world that was becoming increasingly digital, intangible, and screen-based, Netflix succeeded by mastering the physical. They understood the tactile pleasure of the object. They understood the anticipation. The waiting was part of the charm. In the age of instant streaming, we have lost the sweetness of anticipation. We click and we watch. But in the era of the red envelope, there was a gap between the desire and the fulfillment. You added a movie to your queue on Monday. You thought about it. You looked forward to it. And when it arrived on Thursday, it was an event. Movie night was not just a default state of boredom. It was an occasion marked by the arrival of the Red Square. As the months of 1999 turned into the new millennium, the anchor of the blockbuster model began to rust. The video stores were still there, bright and loud and full of candy, but they felt increasingly archaic. They felt like chores. Why drive? Why search the aisles only to find the copy is checked out? Why worry about the clock? The red envelope offered a quiet, civilized alternative. It offered a world where the library comes to you, where the due date does not exist, and where the only limit is how fast you can watch. The epiphany had taken root. The subscription model had aligned the business with the human desire for freedom. And in millions of living rooms, the low-level hum of anxiety was silenced, replaced by the soft whir of a spinning disc and the promise that there was always something else coming in the mail. The red envelope had become a ghost in the machine of the Postal Service, a virus of convenience spreading from house to house, rewriting the rules of ownership one DVD at a time. Chapter 5, The Glass Fortress. The landscape of power is vertical. In the flat, sprawling geography of Texas, where the horizon stretches out in an endless, dusty line, power asserts itself by rising. It builds towers of glass and steel that pierce the blue sky, declaring dominion over the earth below. It was to one of these towers that Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph traveled in the early autumn of 2000. They were not traveling as conquerors. They were traveling as petitioners. The narrative of history often repaints these moments with the golden brush of destiny, suggesting that the founders of Netflix walked into the headquarters of Blockbuster with a secret weapon and a smirk. But the truth was far more fragile. They were tired, they were anxious, and, to put it bluntly, they were running out of money. The dot-com bubble, that great shimmering hallucination that had fueled the economy for years, was beginning to wobble. The air was leaking out. Investors were closing their checkbooks. The chaotic, joyful energy of the Scotts Valley garage had curdled into a cold reality. Shipping DVDs through the mail was expensive, and acquiring customers cost more than the customers were paying. They needed a lifeline, and so they booked a flight to Dallas. The destination was the Renaissance Tower. It was a monolith of 21st-century corporate architecture, a crystalline structure that shot up nearly 900 feet into the air. It was the headquarters of Blockbuster Video. To understand the psychological weight of this meeting, one must understand the sheer scale of the opponent. Blockbuster was not just a company, it was a nation-state. It had 60,000 employees, it had 9,000 stores. It had billions of dollars in revenue. It was as permanent and immovable as the tectonic plates. Reed and Mark arrived in a rental car. They were dressed in suits. For men of Silicon Valley accustomed to the uniform of chinos and polo shirts, a suit is a costume. It feels stiff. The collar chafes. The tie feels like a leash. It is a physical submission to the norms of the old world. They walked into the lobby. It was a cavern of polished marble and echoing footsteps. The air was conditioned to a meat locker chill. a stark contrast to the Texas heat baking the pavement outside. They approached the security desk, stated their names, and were given badges. Visitor. They rode the elevator up. The sensation of a high-speed elevator in a skyscraper is a physical manifestation of ascent. Your ears pop, your stomach drops slightly. You watch the numbers climb, 10, 20, 30, 40. With every floor, you are moving further away from the street, further away from the reality of the consumer, and deeper into the rarefied air of the executive class. They stepped out onto the top floor. The view was breathtaking. From the floor-to-ceiling windows, Dallas looked like a circuit board, a grid of highways and buildings laid out in silent order. You could see for miles. It was a view that simulated godhood. When you stand that high, the people down below become invisible. The traffic becomes a flow of abstract particles. It is easy, standing behind that glass, to believe that you understand the world perfectly, because you can see all of it. This was the glass fortress. It was beautiful, clean, and terrifyingly quiet. They were ushered into a conference room. It was vast. The table was a long, gleaming expanse of mahogany, polished to a mirror finish. It was big enough to land a small plane on. At the center of the table sat a crystal bowl of water with floating lemons. The chairs were heavy leather, the kind that sigh when you sit in them. They waited. The wait is a classic power dynamic. It reminds the visitor of the hierarchy of time. Reed and Mark sat there, their small slide deck and their precarious business model resting on the mahogany. They looked at the view. They looked at each other. They didn't speak much. The silence of the room swallowed whispers. Then the doors opened. John Antioco walked in. He was the Caesar of this empire. He was a man who radiated the easy, relaxed confidence of someone who has already won. He didn't need to be aggressive. He didn't need to be loud. He was the CEO of a company that dominated its industry so completely that it had no natural predators. He was flanked by his lieutenants, men in expensive suits with sharp eyes and firm handshakes. Antioco was charming. He was known as a brilliant operator, a retail genius who had turned companies around. He had the firm jaw and the silver hair of a statesman. He shook hands with Reed and Mark. He offered them water. He sat at the head of the table, leaning back, his body language open and inviting. So, he seemed to say with his posture, "Tell me a story." Reed began the pitch. He was the analytical half of the duo, the mathematician. He spoke of the future. He spoke of the internet not as a fad, but as a utility. He explained the Netflix model, the subscription, the queue, the personalized recommendation engine. He spoke about the efficiency of the distribution centers they were building. But he wasn't just talking about his own company. He was painting a picture of a partnership. The logic was sound. Blockbuster was the king of the physical world. They had the stores, the brand, the inventory. Netflix was the scrappy prince of the digital world. They had the website, the algorithm, and the understanding of online behavior. "We should be your online arm," Reed proposed. "We will run Blockbuster.com for you. You promote us in your stores. We handle the logistics. We combine forces. You get the future, we get the scale." It was a sensible proposal. It was a synergy that could have saved one company and catapulted the other. It was a bridge between the atoms and the bits. The Blockbuster executives listened. They were polite, they nodded at the right times, but there was a gloss over their eyes, the glazed look of men listening to a child explain an imaginary game. To them, the internet was noise. It was a nuisance. Their business was real estate and popcorn. Their business was the late fee. Their business was the impulse buy on a Friday night. The idea that people would want to wait 3 days for a movie seemed counterintuitive to everything they knew about human impatience. Also, they had the numbers. The dot-com crash was in the news every day. Companies like Pets.com were vanishing into thin air. Why should they lash their Titanic ship to a sinking life raft? The presentation concluded. The room was quiet again. The floating lemons drifted in the crystal bowl. Then came the question. The inevitable, jagged question that defines every acquisition meeting. "How much?" Antioco asked. "If we were to buy you, what is the number?" Reed and Mark had discussed this on the plane. They had debated the value of their sweat, their code, and their customer list. They knew they were desperate, but they also knew they had built something unique. They had a number in their heads. It was a reach. It was ambitious. But it was the price of the future. Reed took a breath. He looked John Antioco in the eye. $50 million. The words hung in the air. $50 million. In the context of Blockbuster's valuation, which was billions, 50 million was a rounding error. It was the cost of opening a few dozen new stores. It was the marketing budget for a summer quarter. It was, objectively, a steal for the infrastructure of the next century. But in that room, in that moment, it was a punchline. John Antioco didn't yell, he didn't get angry, he didn't throw them out. He smiled. And then he struggled to suppress a laugh. It wasn't a cruel laugh, necessarily. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard a very good joke. It was the incredulity of the giant looking at the ant. 50 million? For a website? For a company that is losing money on every shipment? One of the other executives chimed in, perhaps seeing the flush rise on Mark Randolph's neck. The dot-com hysteria is over. The sentiment ran. The market is correcting. This business model isn't sustainable. The meeting didn't end abruptly, but the energy left the room instantly. The rejection was absolute. It wasn't a "let us think about it," it was a "thank you for coming, but you are living in a fantasy world." The air in the room seemed to get colder. The view of Dallas, which had looked so majestic a moment ago, now looked indifferent. The glass walls of the fortress felt less like a window and more like a barrier. Reed and Mark packed up their slide deck. They shook hands again. The grips were looser this time. The dismissal was palpable. They were being walked out. They rode the elevator down. The descent was silent. 40 floors, 30 floors, 20, the popping of the ears, the sinking of the stomach. They were falling back to earth. They walked through the marble lobby, past the security guards, and out into the blast of the Texas heat. The humidity hit them like a physical blow. They loosened their ties. They walked to the rental car. Inside the car, the air conditioning blasted, but it couldn't cool the sting of the moment. It is a specific psychological wound to be laughed at. Anger is easier to handle. Anger implies you are a threat. Hatred is validating. Hatred means you matter. But laughter? Laughter means you are insignificant. Laughter means you are cute. Laughter means you are already dead. And you just don't know it yet. Blockbuster.com, Mark said, staring out the window at the passing strip malls. They think it's a joke. They don't see it, Reed said. His voice was flat, clipped. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was looking at the road, his mind already churning, dismantling the meeting, analyzing the failure. They had gone to Dallas, looking for a savior. They had gone looking for a way out of the grind. They had offered the keys to the kingdom to the emperor, and the emperor had chuckled. But as the miles rolled by, moving them toward the airport and the flight back to California, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the car. The humiliation began to harden. It cooled and crystallized into something sharp. If Blockbuster had bought them, Netflix would have become a button on a website. It would have become a department within a massive bureaucracy. It would have been absorbed, metabolized, and likely neglected. But Blockbuster had said no. That no was a death sentence, or it was a mandate. There was no middle ground anymore. There was no safety net. They couldn't sell the company. They couldn't partner. They had to win. And to win, they had to destroy the very thing they had just visited. They had to topple the tower. The flight home was long. The cabin was dark. Reed stared at the seat back in front of him. He thought about the $50 million. He thought about the smile on Antioco's face. He realized then that the greatest weakness of the fortress was not its walls, but its view. When you are that high up, when you are behind that much glass, you can't see the cracks in the foundation. You can't see the ground shifting. You can't see the small red envelopes multiplying in the mailboxes of the world like a virus. Blockbuster was betting on the past. They were betting on the habit. They were betting on the store. Netflix was betting on the laziness of the human animal. They were betting on the desire to never leave the couch. The plane touched down in San Jose. The tires screeched against the tarmac. The reality of their financial situation was still there waiting for them. The servers were still expensive. The bank account was still draining. But something had changed. The uncertainty was gone. The ambiguity of "maybe we can sell" had evaporated. They walked through the terminal, back into the fog and the cool air of the Bay Area. They were alone. They were underfunded. They were the laughingstock of the industry giants. And they were dangerous. Because there is nothing more dangerous than a desperate creature that has been humiliated. The glass fortress had locked its gates, believing it was keeping the barbarians out. but in doing so it had locked itself in. Reed got into his car. He drove over the hill, back toward the coast. The lights of the valley twinkled below him, a sea of silicon and ambition. He didn't know how they were going to survive the next year. He didn't know how they would pay for the postage. But he knew one thing for certain. He was never going to walk into a room and be laughed at again. The giant had blinked. The giant had looked at the future and closed its eyes. Now the war would truly begin. It wouldn't be fought with meetings and handshakes. It would be fought in the trenches of the database, in the sorting machines of the Postal Service, and in the living rooms of America. It would be a war of attrition, fought one plastic disc at a time. And the first casualty would be the complacency of the man in the tower. Chapter 6. Walking Through the Ash. The seasons in California are subtle. They do not announce themselves with the shedding of leaves or the falling of snow. Instead, they manifest as shifts in the quality of the light, or changes in the density of the fog that clings to the coastal hills. But in the year 2000, a winter arrived that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a winter of the economy, a sudden and brutal frost that descended upon the sun-drenched valley of ambition. The dot-com bubble, that great shimmering sphere of iridescent optimism that had floated above the world for 5 years, finally touched the needle. It didn't deflate slowly, it burst. To understand the atmosphere of this chapter, one must strip away the noise of the previous years. Gone was the frantic screech of the modem. Gone were the celebratory uncorkings of champagne. Gone was the manic belief that the rules of gravity no longer applied to businesses that ended in .com. The sound of the crash was silence. It was the silence of telephones that stopped ringing. It was the silence of empty parking lots where, just months before, BMWs and Porsches had fought for spaces. It was the silence of office parks turning into ghost towns, the for-lease signs sprouting like weeds in the manicured lawns of Menlo Park in Palo Alto. For the team at Netflix, the world had turned gray. They had returned from Dallas not with a check, but with a reality check. The $50 million they had asked for was a fantasy. The giant had laughed, and now the giant was turning its back. They were alone, and they were bleeding. The financial term is burn rate. It is a visceral metaphor. It imagines money as fuel for a fire that keeps the engine running. In the heady days of the boom, the fuel was infinite. Investors threw logs onto the fire faster than the company could consume them. But now, the woodpile was gone. The fire was dying down to embers, and the cold was creeping in. Reed Hastings sat in his office, staring at a spreadsheet that told a grim story. The mathematics of the business were ruthless. Every DVD they shipped cost money. Every customer they acquired cost money. And while the subscription model was growing, it wasn't growing fast enough to outpace the burn. The company was losing money on every single shipment. They were subsidizing the movie habits of America, paying for the privilege of being used. The NASDAQ stock ticker, once a scoreboard of victory, had become a casualty list. Companies that had been the darlings of magazine covers, Pets.com, Webvan, eToys, were evaporating into thin air. They were simply ceasing to exist. The furniture was being auctioned off, the servers were being unplugged, the dreamers were packing up their boxes and driving back to the real world. Netflix was next. The air in the Scotts Valley office, once thick with the smell of pizza and adrenaline, was now heavy with the metallic taste of fear. The employees knew. You can always tell when a company is in trouble. It's in the small things. The free sodas disappear from the fridge. The travel budget vanishes. The executives stop walking the floor and start spending hours behind closed doors, their faces drawn and serious. Reed and Mark Randolph had to make a choice. It was the kind of choice that keeps you awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wishing you were anyone else. To save the ship, they had to lighten the load. They couldn't cut the servers. The site had to stay up. They couldn't cut the inventory. The movies were the product. They couldn't cut the postage. The mail was the lifeline. The only thing left to cut was the people. The day of the layoff is a specific kind of trauma in the corporate world. It is a ritual of separation. They called it a reduction in force, a sterile, bureaucratic euphemism that tries to mask the violence of the act. But there is no way to mask it. Reed sat with his managers. They had a list of names. It was a roster of the people who had built the company. These were the people who had stuffed the first envelopes. These were the people who had written the code in the middle of the night. These were the people who had believed when nobody else did. And now they had to decide who was essential and who was expendable. They divided the staff into piles, like the DVDs they sorted in the warehouse. The keepers and the leavers. It was an exercise in ruthless pragmatism. They couldn't afford loyalty. They could only afford performance. If you were good, you stayed. If you were merely adequate, you went. The day arrived under a blanket of coastal fog. The office was quiet, but it was a tense, vibrating silence. Everyone knew something was happening. The calendar invites had gone out. Mysterious meetings were scheduled in conference rooms that had the blinds drawn. We follow a generic employee. Let's call him David through this morning. David is a programmer. He's been there for 2 years. He has shares in the company, paper wealth that he once thought would buy him a house in the hills. Now, those shares are worth less than the paper they are printed on. He sits at his desk. He tries to work, but his hands are cold. He watches his colleagues being tapped on the shoulder one by one. "Can you come with me for a minute?" It is always the same phrase, gentle, polite, and final. David watches a friend stand up. The friend looks pale. He follows the manager into a glass-walled room. David watches through the glass. He can't hear the words, but he knows the script. The market conditions, the need to restructure. It's not personal. Here is your severance package. He sees his friend nod. He sees the shoulders slump. It is the physical posture of defeat. Then, the walk back to the desk. This is the hardest part, the walk of the ghost. The person is still there, but they are already gone. Their access to the email is being cut. Their badge is being deactivated. They are a civilian again. David waits. The hours stretch. The office is emptying out. Empty chairs, dark monitors. He is not tapped on the shoulder. By the afternoon, it is over. 1/3 of the company is gone, 40% of the workforce, 40% of the laughter, the ideas, the shared history. The survivors gathered in the main area. The room felt cavernous. There was too much space. The noise of the bustling startup was replaced by the hum of the ventilation system. Reed stood before them. He did not offer platitudes. He did not say everything is going to be fine. He respected them too much for that. He told them the truth. "The storm is here," he said, in so many words. "We are in the middle of the ocean, and the waves are high. We have let our friends go so that the rest of us can survive. We have to be better. We have to be faster. We have to be smarter. Because there is no safety net anymore." It was a sobering speech. It was the moment the company lost its innocence. The family atmosphere of the early days died that afternoon. A family does not fire its children. Netflix was no longer a family. It was a professional sports team. A team exists to win. If you cannot play at the championship level, you are cut from the roster. This philosophy, born in the ash of the dot-com crash, would become the bedrock of the Netflix culture. Freedom and responsibility. But in that moment, it just felt like loss. The weeks that followed were a grind. The office was a quieter place. The people who remained worked with a focused, almost desperate intensity. There was a sense of survivor's guilt, yes, but also a sense of clarity. The distractions were gone. The fluff was gone. The grand, expensive marketing campaigns were canceled. They couldn't afford billboards. They couldn't afford radio ads. They had to rely on the only thing they had left, the red envelope. They needed the product to speak for itself. They needed Mrs. Jones in Ohio to tell Mrs. Smith next door that she had to try this service. They needed the experience to be perfect. And then, in the midst of this bleak winter, a small miracle occurred. Not a miracle of finance, but a miracle of hardware. The price of the DVD player began to drop. For years, the player had been a luxury item, costing upwards of $500. It was a barrier to entry. You couldn't subscribe to Netflix if you didn't have the machine. But the manufacturing giants in Asia, Sony, Toshiba, Panasonic, had been busy. They had scaled up production. The economies of scale kicked in. Suddenly, you could walk into a Best Buy or a Walmart and find a DVD player for under $100. It was the tipping point. The razor and blade model of the economy began to turn in Netflix's favor. The player was the razor, and it was becoming cheap. The movies were the blades, and Netflix had the best supply in the world. Reed watched the numbers. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a steady, upward creep. The line on the graph, which had been flatlining, began to angle north. People were buying players for Christmas. And the first thing they did when they unboxed the shiny silver machine was look for something to watch. And there, in the box, was a coupon. A slip of paper offering a free trial of Netflix. It was a strategy born of desperation. partnering with the hardware manufacturers because they couldn't afford TV ads. But it was working. The envelopes went out, the discs came back, the subscription fees trickled in. The office in Scotts Valley began to feel less like a hospice and more like a bunker. They were under siege, yes. The market was still terrible. The stock price of technology companies was still in the gutter. But they were alive. They were walking through the ash of the burnt-down forest, and they were finding green shoots. There is a specific resilience that is forged in this kind of environment. When you have looked into the abyss of bankruptcy, when you have fired your friends, when you have been laughed at by the industry leaders, you lose your fear. You have already experienced the worst. The team that remained was hardened. They were the cockroaches of the dot-com bust, a term used with begrudging respect in the valley. They were the ones you couldn't kill. They optimized everything. They obsessed over the weight of the paper insert to save a fraction of a penny on postage. They tweaked the algorithm to recommend older movies that were cheaper to stock. They turned frugality into an art form. There were no more parties, no more swag. Just the rhythmic industrial sound of the sorting machines and the quiet tapping of keyboards. One evening, late, Reed walked through the parking lot. The fog had rolled in again, obscuring the stars. The lot was mostly empty, save for the cars of the diehards who were still inside, keeping the servers humming. He stopped and looked back at the building. It wasn't the glass fortress of Dallas. It was a nondescript office in a nondescript town. But it was still standing. The world had said that the internet was a fad. The world had said that shipping atoms was a dead end. The world had said they were worth nothing. But the red envelopes were still traveling through the night, thousands of them, moving through the veins of the postal system, sliding into mailboxes, sitting on coffee tables. Each one was a small flag of defiance. They hadn't won yet. They were far from winning. But they had survived the winter. And as anyone who works the land knows, after the fire burns through the forest, the soil that remains is rich and ready for growth. The trees were gone. The view was clear. Reed got into his car and drove home. The road was dark, but he knew the way. The silence of the crash was fading, replaced by the low, steady thrum of an engine that was finally, after years of sputtering, beginning to catch. The survivors were ready to build again, but this time they wouldn't build a castle of sand. They would build something harder, something sharper, something that could cut through the glass walls of the giants. The ash was settling, the ground was firm, and the queue was loading. Chapter 7, The Oracle in the Code. The warehouse in San Jose was a cathedral of noise. It was a physical place, defined by the slap of sneakers on concrete, the whir of sorting belts, and the rustle of paper envelopes. It was a place of atoms governed by the laws of friction and gravity. But 50 miles away, in the quiet, carpeted corridors of the engineering office, a different kind of structure was being built. It was a structure made not of steel and plastic, but of logic and memory. It was silent. It was invisible. And unlike the warehouse, which stored the movies, this structure stored the ghosts of the people who watched them. We enter now the realm of the algorithm. To understand the necessity of this invention, one must first understand the paralysis of the modern human. In the old world, the world of the physical video store, choice was limited by geography. You walked into a Blockbuster, and you were surrounded by perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 titles. Most of them were new releases, the box art bright and demanding. You walked the aisles, you picked a box, you went home. The boundaries were clear. But Netflix had shattered the boundaries. The library was growing, 10,000 titles, 20,000, 50,000. The website was a window into an abyss of content. When a customer logged in, they were not standing in a friendly neighborhood store. They were standing on the edge of a digital ocean. Without a map, the abundance was terrifying. A user would scroll and scroll and scroll, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of stories. The covers would blur together. The titles would lose their meaning. This is the paradox of choice. When presented with everything, the human mind often chooses nothing. It retreats. It closes the browser. The company realized that they didn't just need to be a delivery service. They needed to be a guide. In the video store, the guide was the clerk. He was a teenager with acne and a name tag, leaning against the counter. He was a human filter. You would ask him, "I like Die Hard, what else should I watch?" And he would scan his memory, filter it through his own biases, and hand you Lethal Weapon. It was an imperfect system. The clerk might be tired, he might have terrible taste, he might judge you for renting a romantic comedy. Netflix needed a clerk that never slept, never judged, and had watched every movie in existence. They couldn't hire 100,000 film critics, so they decided to build a mathematical one. They called it Cinematch. The creation of Cinematch was less like engineering a car and more like mapping the stars. The engineers and mathematicians sat in low-light rooms, staring at monitors filled with streams of data. They weren't looking at plot summaries or director names. They were looking at patterns of behavior. The raw material for this oracle was the star. The 5-star rating system is a language we take for granted today, but in the early 2000s, it was a relatively novel way to quantify emotion. 1 star? Hated it. 3 stars? Liked it. 5 stars? Loved it. Every time a user clicked a star, they were whispering a secret to the machine. They were leaving a breadcrumb. I am a person who loves explosions. I am a person who cries at period dramas. I am a person who enjoys bad horror movies from the 1980s. The database began to fill with these whispers, millions of them, a constellation of preferences. The challenge for the code was to draw lines between the stars. It was a problem of, quote, collaborative filtering. The math is complex, but the philosophy is deeply human. We are not as unique as we think we are. The code operated on the assumption that taste is tribal. If you, sitting in your apartment in New York, rate 3 specific movies highly, and a stranger in a farmhouse in Nebraska rates those same 3 movies highly, then you are neighbors in the data. You share a taste cluster. You are chemically similar in your consumption of art. Therefore, if the stranger in Nebraska finds a 4th movie and loves it, there is a very high mathematical probability that you will love it too. The machine didn't need to know why you liked it. It didn't need to understand the plot, the cinematography, or the acting. It didn't need to have a soul. It just needed to see the connection. It was a process of triangulation. The algorithm began to group people into invisible cities. Here is the city of dark British crime thrillers. Here is the village of quirky indie comedies featuring strong female leads. Here is the vast metropolis of Adam Sandler. The beauty of the system was its blindness. It didn't care about the prestige of the film. It treated an Academy Award winner and a direct-to-video slasher with the same neutral curiosity. Let us imagine the experience of the user in this era. It is late at night, and the house is quiet. A man sits in front of his computer, the glow of the CRT monitor illuminating his face. He is looking for something to watch next week. He rates a few movies he has seen recently. He gives The Godfather 5 stars. He gives Toy Story 5 stars. He waits. On the servers in California, the Oracle wakes up. It takes these inputs and runs them against the matrix of millions of other users. It finds the neighbors. It scans their histories. It looks for the commonalities. It rejects the noise. It calculates the probability of enjoyment for thousands of unwatched titles. The screen refreshes. Recommendations for you. The list appears. It is uncanny. It suggests a movie he has never heard of, a crime drama from the 1970s, something dusty and forgotten, The French Connection. He pauses. Why this? He clicks on it. He reads the synopsis. It looks perfect. It looks exactly like the kind of thing he would enjoy, though he couldn't have articulated why. He clicks Add to Queue. In that click, a loop is closed. The machine has successfully predicted a human desire before the human was even aware of it. This was the Netflix effect. It was the feeling of being known. But there was a deeper layer to the psychology of the algorithm, one that the engineers discovered as they dug into the data. They found that human beings are liars. Or perhaps liars is too harsh, we're aspirational. When people created their profiles, they often rated movies they thought they should like. They gave high ratings to dense documentaries about World War II. They gave high ratings to foreign art films with subtitles. They populated their queues with vegetable movies. Good for you, nutritious, but difficult to chew. But when Thursday night came and the work week was done and they were tired, they didn't want vegetables. They wanted candy. They wanted the sitcom. They wanted the explosion. They wanted the comfort watch. The algorithm saw this. It saw the difference between what people said they liked, the high ratings for Schindler's List, and what they actually watched, the repeat viewings of Friends. The Oracle had to learn to navigate this duality. It had to learn to serve the user's actual self, not their idealized self. It learned that a 3-star rating for a comedy might actually mean, I will watch this 10 times, while a 5-star rating for a tragedy might mean, I respect this, but I never want to see it again. The code became a mirror that reflected the truth of human leisure. We are complex, we want to be smart, but we also want to be soothed. For the business, Cinematch was not just a parlor trick, it was the engine of survival. Remember the warehouse, remember the cost of inventory. New release movies, the big blockbusters that everyone wanted, were expensive. Netflix had to buy them in bulk, and the studios charged a premium. If every subscriber only wanted to watch Spider-Man, Netflix would go bankrupt buying enough copies to satisfy the demand. But older movies? The back catalog? Those were cheap. They were already sitting on the shelves, paid for, gathering dust. The algorithm became the ultimate salesperson for the long tail. The long tail is an economic concept that suggests there is as much value in selling small amounts of many rare items as there is in selling large amounts of a few popular items. Cinematch was designed to gently nudge the user away from the expensive new releases and toward the hidden gems. If Spider-Man was out of stock, the algorithm wouldn't just say, wait. It would say, if you like Spider-Man, you might love this anime from 1995, or this superhero deconstruction from 2001. It surfaced the inventory that no video store clerk would ever recommend. It found an audience for the weird, the niche, and the forgotten. Suddenly, movies that had been commercially dead were finding a second life. A documentary about fonts, Helvetica, or a small indie film about a station agent, the station agent, would suddenly see a spike in rentals. Why? Because the math found the people who would love them. It was a symbiotic relationship. The user got a great movie they hadn't seen. The company got a circulated disc that cost them nothing extra to stock. Everyone won. The atmosphere in the engineering department during these years was one of quiet, intellectual intensity. They were not just coding a website, they were decoding culture. They held contests. They offered a $1 million prize, the famous Netflix prize, to anyone outside the company who could beat their algorithm by 10%. It was a challenge issued to the world's data scientists. Can you predict the human heart better than we can? Teams from around the globe competed. They merged, they shared theories, they treated the Netflix dataset like the Rosetta Stone. It was a global acknowledgement that the problem of what to watch was one of the great puzzles of the information age. As the years passed, the oracle grew smarter. It stopped looking at just stars. It started looking at clusters. It started looking at time of day. It started looking at completion rates. But in the era of the red envelope, the magic was still slow. It was a slow-motion conversation between the user and the machine. You rated a movie on Monday. The algorithm thought about it. You got a recommendation on Tuesday. You received the disc on Thursday. You watched it on Saturday. You rated it on Sunday. The feedback loop took a week. This slowness allowed for a certain romance. The recommendations felt thoughtful. They arrived like suggestions from a pen pal. The algorithm was the ghost in the machine, yes, but it was a benevolent ghost. It was a curator that lived in the wires, tirelessly sorting through the chaos of cinema to find the one story that would resonate with your specific frequency. It was the beginning of the personalization of the world. Before Cinematch, mass media was truly mass. Everyone watched the same 3 channels. Everyone rented the same 10 movies. After Cinematch, the culture began to splinter. We began to retreat into our own private, curated universes. The glass fortress of Blockbuster relied on the monoculture. It relied on everyone wanting the same hit movie at the same time. Netflix relied on the individual. It relied on the unique, strange, specific taste of the single user. And the code knew. It knew that you liked romantic comedies, but only the ones set in London. It knew you liked sci-fi, but only the ones with sad endings. It knew you better than your spouse did. In the quiet hum of the server room, the data piled up. Millions of stars, millions of connections. A digital map of human emotion, expanding every second, preparing for the day when the delay would vanish, and the recommendation would become a stream. Chapter 8. The Ghost in the Wire. The ocean floor is a quiet place. It is dark, pressurized, and cold. It is a landscape of silt and silence, untouched by the sun for millions of years. But winding through this darkness, snaking across the continental shelves and plunging into the abyssal plains, are cables. They are not much thicker than a garden hose. Inside them, shielded by layers of steel, copper, and plastic, are strands of glass as thin as a human hair. And through these glass hairs, light is pulsing. In the mid-2000s, this was the secret anatomy of the world. While humanity walked around on the surface, dealing with traffic and weather and physical mail, the true nervous system of the planet was being laid in the deep. These cables were the conduits of the internet. They were the pipes through which the world was beginning to pour its consciousness. For the first decade of its existence, Netflix had been a company of the surface. It was a company of trucks, warehouses, sorting machines, and paper envelopes. It moved atoms. It dealt with the friction of the physical world, the snowstorms that delayed the mail, the scratched discs, the lost shipments. But Reed Hastings had always known that the atoms were temporary. The name of the company was a prophecy. It was not Mailflix. It was not DVD Flix. It was Netflix. The internet was in the title. The red envelope, for all its success, for all the joy it brought to millions of mailboxes, was merely a bridge. It was a placeholder technology, waiting for the pipes to get big enough to carry the heavy cargo of a motion picture. In 2007, the pipes were finally starting to hum. The transition from a physical business to a digital one is not just a change in logistics, it is a psychological crisis. Imagine you are a gold miner. You have spent 10 years building the perfect mine. You have the best pickaxes, the best carts, the best system for extracting the ore. You are making millions. The mine is successful. Everyone loves your gold. Then, one day, you realize that to survive the future, you must blow up your own mine. You must stop digging for gold and start catching the wind. This is the innovator's dilemma. It is the trap that kills great companies. Kodak died because it couldn't let go of film. Blockbuster was dying because it couldn't let go of the store. Netflix now faced its own mirror. The DVD business was a cash cow. It was efficient, profitable, and beloved. To launch a streaming service, to allow people to watch movies instantly over the internet, was to invite a cannibal to dinner. If streaming worked, nobody would need the red envelope. If streaming worked, the warehouses would close. If streaming worked, the entire infrastructure they had spent a decade perfecting would become obsolete. The tension in the Netflix offices during this period was palpable. It was a quiet war between the present and the future. There were meetings where the logic of self-destruction was debated. Why are we spending millions on this? The skeptics would ask. The quality is terrible. The internet is too slow. People love the discs. And they were right. In 2007, the internet was not the smooth, high-definition highway we know today. It was a dirt road. It was prone to congestion. It was unreliable. But Reed looked at the curve. In technology, you do not skate to where the puck is. You skate to where the puck is going to be. Moore's law said that processing power would double. Bandwidth would increase. The cost of storage would plummet to zero. The ghost was coming. The only choice was whether to be the one who summoned it or the one who was haunted by it. The project to build the streaming service was a secret, tucked away in the corners of the engineering department. It wasn't about cinematic grandeur, it was about compression. A movie on a DVD is a massive file. It is gigabytes of data. To shove that much information through a standard 2007 broadband connection was like trying to push a watermelon through a drinking straw. It couldn't fit. The engineers had to chop the watermelon up. They had to liquefy it. They worked on codecs, algorithms that squeezed the video, throwing away the information the human eye wouldn't notice, compressing the file until it was a trickle of data that could flow over the wire. The result was imperfect. The image was grainy. The colors were washed out. If the connection faltered, the video would stop, and a spinning circle would appear in the center of the screen. Buffering. This word would become the defining anxiety of the era. It was the digital equivalent of the traffic jam. It was the reminder that the illusion of flow was fragile. You were watching a story, immersed in the emotion, and then, stop. The circle spins. The magic breaks. You are staring at a computer screen in a dark room, waiting for the data to catch up. But despite the grain, despite the buffering, there was something intoxicating about the immediacy. We must remember the friction of the disc. To watch a DVD, you had to plan days in advance. You had to wait for the mail. You had to open the envelope. You had to put the disc in the tray. The streaming prototype removed the wait. You clicked, and suddenly there was the movie. It felt like a magic trick. It felt like accessing a library that was floating in the air. The launch of the service was not a Super Bowl commercial moment. It was a whisper. In January of 2007, a new tab appeared on the website. It was humble. It said simply, "Watch instantly." There was no extra charge. There was no new subscription. It was presented as a bonus feature, a little value add for the loyal customers. If you paid for the DVD plan, you got a certain number of hours of streaming for free. The library was pathetic. The Hollywood studios were terrified of the internet. They had seen what happened to the music industry. They had seen Napster. They had seen piracy destroy the value of the album. They were not about to hand over their crown jewels, Star Wars, Titanic, The Godfather, to a website. So they gave Netflix the scraps. The initial streaming library consisted of about 1,000 titles. Most of them were B-movies, old documentaries, and films that had long since vanished from the public consciousness. It was a garage sale of content. But the users clicked. Let us visualize the experience of that first click. A college student in a dorm room, surrounded by textbooks and empty noodle cups. He opens his laptop. It is a thick plastic machine, running hot, the fan whirring like a hairdryer. He logs into Netflix. He sees the new tab, Watch Instantly. He clicks it. A browser plugin installs, perhaps a clunky piece of software that takes a moment to load. The screen goes black. And then, out of the darkness, a logo appears. Sound comes through the tinny laptop speakers. The movie begins. He isn't holding anything. There is no case. There is no disc. The movie is arriving in packets of light, traveling thousands of miles through those undersea cables, routing through server farms in Virginia or Oregon, bouncing through the local exchange, and reassembling itself on his screen in real time. He is witnessing the death of distance. He watches the whole thing. It's a bad kung fu movie from the 1970s. The pixels are blocky during the fight scenes. But he doesn't care. When it's over, he doesn't have to rewind. He doesn't have to put it in an envelope. He doesn't have to walk to the mailbox. He just closes the laptop. The transaction cost has dropped to zero. The friction has vanished. In that dorm room and in thousands of living rooms across the country, a neurological shift was occurring. The brain was learning that gratification could be instant. The concept of patience was being rewritten. Back at headquarters, the data began to flow in. The engineers watched the server logs. They saw the usage climbing. It wasn't explosive at first. Most people still preferred the high quality of the DVD on their big television to the muddy stream on their laptop. But the trend was undeniable. People were trading quality for convenience. This is a fundamental truth of the digital age. Convenience always wins. People will listen to low-quality MP3s because they can carry 1,000 of them in their pocket. People will watch a pixelated video because it starts now. The team realized that the Watch Instantly button was not a feature. It was the product. The DVD, the red envelope, the sorting machines, all of it was just a long, expensive prologue. But the industry didn't see it yet. Hollywood looked at the streaming service and saw a toy. They saw the low resolution. They saw the limited library. They laughed, just as Blockbuster had laughed years before. They were happy to license their older, less valuable content to Netflix for pennies, believing that streaming would never replace the lucrative DVD sales or the box office. They were feeding the beast while it was still a puppy, not realizing how big it would grow. The Starz deal is a perfect example of this blindness. Netflix signed a deal with the cable channel Starz to stream their movies. It cost Netflix a significant amount, around $30 million. But in hindsight, it was a robbery. For that price, Netflix got access to real movies. Spider-Man, Ratatouille, hits. Suddenly, the Watch Instantly tab wasn't just a garage sale. It had legitimate blockbusters. The value proposition for the customer shifted violently. For $8 a month, you could have DVDs in the mail and thousands of movies on your computer. It was the best deal in the history of entertainment. But as the ghost in the wire grew stronger, the internal identity crisis at Netflix deepened. The company was split in two. On one side were the DVD operations. These were the people who ran the warehouses. They were the masters of atoms. They dealt with the USPS, the trucks, the physical inventory. They generated the revenue. They paid the bills. They were the establishment. On the other side were the streamers. These were the software engineers, the UI designers, the cloud architects. They lived in the abstract. They burned money. They generated almost no revenue because streaming was free with the subscription. They were the insurgents. Reed Hastings made a controversial decision. He decided to starve the cash cow to feed the puppy. He stopped inviting the DVD managers to the top-level strategy meetings. He moved the best engineers to the streaming team. He made it clear, through culture and compensation, that the future was in the wire, not in the mail. It was a brutal, unsentimental pivot. Imagine telling the people who built your company, the people who perfected the red envelope, that they were now the legacy division. They were the past. The atmosphere in the warehouses changed. The hum of the sorting machines was still loud, but there was a sense of twilight. They knew they were working on a dying timeline. Every time a customer clicked "Watch instantly," it was one less envelope that needed to be stuffed. And then there was the hardware problem. Watching movies on a laptop was fine for college students, but normal people wanted to watch TV on a TV. Netflix needed to get the ghost out of the computer and into the living room. They tried to build their own box, a Netflix player. They spent millions developing it. It was a sleek, black device designed to sit next to the TV and connect to the internet. The engineers poured their souls into it. They were weeks away from launching it. And then, Reed killed it. It was another moment of ruthless clarity. If Netflix launched a box, they would become a hardware company. They would have to compete with Apple, with Sony, with Roku. They would be limited by how many boxes they could sell. Reed realized that Netflix shouldn't be a box. Netflix should be an app. It should be a ghost that could possess any machine. It should be on the Xbox, it should be on the PlayStation, it should be on the Blu-ray player, it should be on the TV itself. He spun off the hardware project, which became Roku, and focused entirely on software. This decision unlocked the world. Suddenly, the Netflix icon began to appear everywhere. It glowed on the dashboard of gaming consoles. It appeared on the menus of smart TVs. It was ubiquitous. The screen didn't matter anymore, the device didn't matter. Netflix was the water, and it would fill whatever vessel you held out. By 2010, the transition was accelerating. The bandwidth of the world was catching up. The cables on the ocean floor were being upgraded. The last mile to the user's home was getting faster. The picture quality improved. The buffering circles spun less often. High definition arrived. The experience of sitting down to watch a movie had fundamentally changed. The ritual of the video store, the drive, the browse, the transaction was a distant memory. Even the ritual of the mailbox, the anticipation, the rip of the envelope, was fading. Now the ritual was a scroll. You sat on your couch. You picked up a remote. You navigated a grid of endless images. You pressed a button. The server in the dark hummed. The light pulsed through the glass fiber. The packet routed through the switch. And the story began. It was a miracle of engineering, a triumph of the digital over the physical. The friction was gone. But in the quiet moments when the binge was over and the screen went black, one might wonder what was lost. The weight of the cassette, the smell of the video store, the patience of the mail. We had traded the heavy, imperfect texture of the real world for the seamless, infinite flow of the stream. We had gained everything, and we had to hold nothing. The ghost was no longer just in the wire, it was in the room with us, it was watching us watch. And it was hungry for more of our time. The red envelope was still traveling the roads, millions of them, like white blood cells in the veins of America. But the heart of the organism had moved. It had uploaded itself. The company was no longer a library. It was a broadcast network that served a population of one. And as the stream grew stronger, the confidence of the company grew with it. They had survived the dot-com crash. They had beaten Blockbuster. They had mastered the mail. Now they had conquered the internet. But hubris is a dangerous thing. When you move too fast, when you stop looking at the ground because you are staring at the cloud, you can trip. And Netflix was about to stumble. The ghost was powerful, but the customers were still human. They were about to remind the company that they could not be programmed quite as easily as the algorithm thought. The Quickster storm was gathering on the horizon. Chapter 9, The Quickster Stumble. Success is a dangerous intoxicant. It is a thin, rarefied air that clouds the judgment, making the ground below seem very far away and the laws of gravity seem like suggestions rather than rules. By the summer of 2011, Netflix was flying at an altitude that few companies ever reach. The stock chart was not a curve, it was a cliff face, ascending vertically into the stratosphere. Reed Hastings was the toast of Silicon Valley, the man who had slain Blockbuster, the visionary who had seen the streaming future when everyone else was staring at plastic discs. The company was invincible. It was the golden child of the new economy. But in the quiet corners of the executive suite, a different kind of anxiety was brewing. It was the anxiety of the visionary who sees the trap before anyone else does. Reed looked at his company and saw a two-headed monster. One head was the DVD business. It was massive, profitable, and beloved. It was the red envelope, it was the legacy. But Reed knew, with the cold certainty of a mathematician, that it was dying. It was a melting ice cube. Every year, physical media would become less relevant. The other head was the streaming business. It was young, hungry, and expensive. It was the future. The problem, as Reed saw it, was that these two heads were fighting for the same body. They were sharing resources. They were confusing the customer. And most importantly, the profitable, comfortable DVD business was acting as a safety net, preventing the company from fully committing to the terrifying, necessary leap into pure streaming. He was haunted by the ghosts of companies that had failed to pivot. He thought of Kodak, clutching its film rolls while digital cameras ate the world. He thought of AOL, clinging to dial-up. He decided that he would not let Netflix become a nostalgia act. He would force the evolution. He would take out a scalpel and separate the Siamese twins. It was a decision born of perfect logic. It was a decision that made absolute sense on a whiteboard in a conference room. But humans do not live on whiteboards. They live in messy, emotional, habit-driven worlds. And they do not like to be told that the thing they love is being taken away. The trouble began with a blog post. It is strange how modern history turns on such small, digital pivots. In the old days, a corporate blunder involved a press conference, flashbulbs, and a sweating spokesman. In 2011, it involved a hit of the publish button. On a warm day in July, the announcement went out. It was framed as a necessity of business. The hybrid plan, the beautiful, simple deal where you paid $10 and got both DVDs and streaming, was ending. If you wanted both, you would now have to pay for them separately. The price for the combination was going up. For many users, it was a 60% increase. The reaction was instantaneous, and it was violent. To understand the rage, one must understand the relationship people had with Netflix. It wasn't like their relationship with the cable company or the electric utility. People hated the cable company. They expected to be gouged, but they loved Netflix. Netflix was the cool friend. Netflix was the service that had saved them from late fees. Netflix was the underdog that had treated them with respect. The price hike felt like a betrayal of that friendship. It felt like the underdog had put on a suit and turned into the landlord. Social media, which had been a tailwind for the company for years, suddenly turned into a hurricane. Facebook walls and Twitter feeds filled with venom. Dear Netflix letters went viral. Thousands of people canceling their subscriptions in public displays of indignation. The stock began to wobble. The golden glow began to fade. But Reed Hastings did not retreat. He was an engineer. He believed in the data. He believed that the anger was temporary, a flare-up of emotion that would settle once people realized the value of the service. He believed that if he just explained the logic clearly enough, people would understand. So he decided to double down. September 2011. The air in the headquarters was tense. The subscriber numbers were dropping. The stock was sliding. The smart move, the political move, would have been to apologize, roll back the price hike, and wait. Instead, Reed decided to finish the surgery. He announced that the separation would be physical. The DVD service would be renamed. It would be kicked out of the house. It would have its own website, its own billing system, its own branding. He called it Quickster. The name itself was a disaster of phonetics. Netflix was smooth. It sounded premium. It evoked the internet and movies. Quickster sounded like a gas station convenience store. It sounded like a cheap startup from the late 90s. It sounded like a mistake. The plan was convoluted. If you wanted to stream a movie, you went to Netflix.com. If you wanted to rent a DVD, you went to https://www.google.com/search?Q=Qwixter.com. The two sites would not talk to each other, your movie ratings would not transfer, your queue would have to be managed in two places. It was the antithesis of the user experience that had made the company famous. It took something simple and made it complex. It took something integrated and broke it in half. And then there was the detail that exposed the rush, the hubris, and the lack of attention to detail that had overtaken the leadership. They hadn't checked the Twitter handle. The account at Quickster was already taken. It belonged to a teenager named Jason Chafin. His profile picture was Elmo, the Sesame Street character, smoking a joint. He posted about soccer and boredom and drugs. When Netflix announced the name, thousands of confused customers flocked to Twitter to find the new service. Instead of a corporate support account, they found a stoned Elmo. It was a farce. The media tore them apart. The late-night comedians made jokes. The narrative shifted from Netflix is greedy to Netflix is incompetent. There is nothing more damaging to a tech company than looking like it doesn't know how to use the internet. The internal atmosphere at Netflix during the Quickster weeks was one of siege. The employees, the ones who answered the phones and monitored the customer service chats, were overwhelmed. They were taking the brunt of the abuse. They were being yelled at by grandmothers who didn't understand why they needed 2 passwords. They were being screamed at by cinephiles who felt their carefully curated cues were being held hostage. Reed watched the stock ticker. It was a bloodbath. The shares, which had traded near $300 in July, were in freefall. They dropped to $200, then $150, then $100. Billions of dollars in market value. Wealth that had been built over a decade of hard work evaporated in weeks. The board of directors was worried. The investors were furious. The sharks began to circle. There were whispers that Reed Hastings, the genius, had lost his mind. There were rumors that the company was ripe for a takeover, that Amazon or Microsoft would swoop in and buy the wreckage for pennies on the dollar. It was a moment of existential peril. The company wasn't just losing money, it was losing its soul. It was losing the trust of the people. Reed realized, finally, that logic was not enough. He realized that he had moved too fast. He had tried to steer the ship into the future, but he had thrown the passengers overboard in the process. He had to do something he had never done before. He had to beg for forgiveness. The apology video is a strange artifact of corporate history. Usually, when a CEO apologizes, they do it from behind a desk, wearing a suit, reading a carefully vetted statement. It is a sterile, legalistic performance. Reed decided to do it differently. He wanted to be authentic. He wanted to show that he was just a human being who had messed up. He filmed it in a backyard. The camera was set up on a tripod. The lighting was natural, which is to say it was unflattering. The background was out of focus. Some greenery, the side of a house. Reed stood next to Andy Rendich, the executive who had been tapped to run Quickster. Reed wore a teal polo shirt. He looked tired. His distinctive goatee was gray. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a neighbor who had accidentally backed his car into your mailbox. He began to speak. "I messed up," he said. "I owe you an explanation." He talked about arrogance. He talked about moving too fast. He used the phrase, slide into arrogance, a poetic admission of how success can corrupt humility. But then he tried to explain the split again. He tried to sell Quickster while apologizing for it. The video was a disaster. It felt awkward. It felt forced. The chemistry between Reed and Andy was stiff. They looked like hostages reading a ransom note. And in the background, faintly audible, was the sound of wind chimes and a passing car. The public didn't want an explanation of corporate strategy in a backyard. They wanted their old Netflix back. The comment section under the video became a wall of graffiti. Thousands of people mocked the shirt, the setting, and the message. It became a meme. The stock dropped again. It was the nadir, the bottom of the valley. Reed sat in his office, or perhaps at his kitchen table, and looked at the wreckage. The Quickster brand was toxic. The DVD business was alienating the streaming customers. The streaming business was suffering from the bad PR. He had to make a choice. He could stubbornly press on, insisting that he was right and the world was wrong. Or he could admit total defeat. He chose defeat. Weeks after the announcement, another blog post appeared. It was short. It was humble. Quickster is dead. There would be no split. There would be no separate websites. There would be no separate bills. The DVD service would remain under the Netflix umbrella. The red envelope would stay where it was. It was a humiliating U-turn. To announce a major strategic shift, brand it, defend it, and then kill it less than a month later is the definition of corporate whiplash. But it stopped the bleeding. The public exhaled. "Okay," they said, "you listened." The anger didn't vanish overnight. Trust is like a mirror. Once it's broken, you can glue it back together, but you can still see the cracks. Customers remained wary. The stock price languished in the basement for a long time, hovering around $60, a fraction of its former glory. But the company was still alive. The winter of 2011 was a quiet time at Netflix. The hubris was gone. The Man of the Year covers were gone. They were back in the trenches. But in the ashes of the Quickster debacle, a new kind of wisdom was forming. Reed had learned a painful lesson about the emotional connection between a brand and its users. He learned that you cannot treat customers like data points in a spreadsheet. You cannot force them to change their behavior just because it suits your business model. He also learned something about the Band-Aid. The mistake he realized wasn't the price hike. The price hike was necessary. The mistake wasn't the focus on streaming. Streaming was the future. The mistake was the communication. The mistake was trying to make the customer care about the company's internal organization. The Quickster failure clarified the mission. The DVD business was dying. That was still true, but they couldn't kill it by pushing it off a cliff. They had to let it die of natural causes. They had to let it fade away slowly, quietly, while making the streaming service so good that people chose to leave the discs behind. They had to seduce the customer, not evict them. The scar tissue from 2011 would make the company tougher. It made them paranoid. It made them obsessive about the customer experience. And it set the stage for the next great gamble. Because while the world was laughing at Quickster, while the analysts were writing obituaries for Netflix, Reed and his team were quietly signing checks. They were looking at the data again. They were looking at the viewing habits of their remaining loyal subscribers. They saw that people liked political thrillers. They saw that people liked David Fincher. They saw that people liked Kevin Spacey. The company was wounded, yes. It was limping, but it was about to do something that no technology company had ever done before. It was about to stop just delivering the mail and start writing the letters. The era of distribution was ending. The era of creation was about to begin. But before they could become a studio, they had to survive the silence of the empty theater. They had to rebuild the trust, one stream at a time. The Quickster name would fade into a trivia answer, a cautionary tale taught in business schools. But for the people who lived through it, it was the fire that burned away the last of the vanity. They were no longer the golden children. They were survivors again. And survivors are dangerous because they have nothing left to lose. The screen was dark. The buffering wheel was spinning. But the movie wasn't over. Chapter 10, The House of Cards. The relationship between a landlord and a tenant is defined by leverage. For years, Netflix had been the model tenant of the entertainment industry. It lived in the guest house of Hollywood, paying rent to stream the movies and shows that the big studios owned. It was a symbiotic arrangement. The studios got a check for content that was sitting idle, and Netflix got a library to feed its growing audience. But by 2012, the landlords were looking at the tenant with suspicion. They noticed that the tenant was throwing better parties than they were. They noticed that the people on the street were talking more about the streaming service than the television networks. The rent began to rise. It wasn't a gradual increase, it was a gouging. The cheap licensing deals that had fueled the early growth of Watch Instantly were expiring, and the renewal prices were astronomical. The studios realized they had underpriced their assets. They saw Netflix not as a partner, but as a parasite that was growing too large. In the corridors of the Beverly Hills office, Ted Sarandos, the chief content officer, felt the walls closing in. He looked at the spreadsheet of expiring contracts. If Stars pulled their movies, if Disney walked away, if NBC took back The Office, Netflix would be left with an empty shelf. They would be a store with no inventory. They were vulnerable because they owned nothing. They were a technology company built on someone else's intellectual property. The realization was stark. To survive, they had to stop being a renter. They had to become a builder. They had to construct their own house. The project that landed on Ted's desk was not a sure thing. It was a remake of a British political drama from the 1990s. It was dark. It was cynical. It was about a politician who speaks directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall to confess his sins and his ambitions. It was being shopped around town by heavyweights. David Fincher, the director known for his meticulous, obsessive visual style, Fight Club, The Social Network, was attached. Kevin Spacey, an actor of immense gravity, was the star. In the traditional logic of television, this package would spark a bidding war, but it would be a war with conditions. HBO, Showtime, and AMC were interested, but they wanted to play by the rules. They wanted a pilot. The pilot is the safety valve of the television industry. It is a single test episode. You spend a few $1,000,000, you film 40 minutes, and then the executives sit in a room and judge it. They test it with focus groups. They analyze the lighting, the pacing, the likability of the characters. If the pilot fails, the project dies, and the losses are contained. Fincher didn't want to make a pilot, he wanted to tell a long story. He didn't want to spend months auditioning his vision for a committee of executives who would give him notes. He wanted a commitment. He wanted a full season. To the traditional networks, this was arrogance. To commit to 13 hours of premium drama without seeing a single frame was financial suicide. It was buying a house without looking at the foundation. But Netflix wasn't looking at the foundation, they were looking at the data. This is the moment where the oracle in the code, the algorithm built in the previous years, stepped out of the shadows and sat at the negotiating table. Ted Sarandos didn't need a pilot, he had something better. He had the viewing history of 30 million people. He turned to the engineers. He asked the ghosts in the machine. Query, do our subscribers like David Fincher? Answer, yes. His movies have high completion rates and low abandonment. Query, do our subscribers like Kevin Spacey? Answer, yes. His films are consistently rated highly. Query, do our subscribers like the original British version of House of Cards? Answer, yes. It is a niche hit, but the people who start it, finish it, they devour it. Then came the Venn diagram moment. The data team overlaid these three circles. They looked for the intersection of Fincher fans, Spacey fans, and political drama fans. The intersection wasn't a sliver, it was a massive, throbbing blot on the map. The math whispered a secret that no focus group could reveal. The audience already existed. They were waiting for this show, they just didn't know it yet. The risk, the algorithm suggested, was an illusion. The traditional networks were guessing based on gut feeling. Netflix was calculating based on behavior. Ted Sarandos went back to the agents. He didn't offer a pilot. He didn't offer a development deal. We will take 2 seasons, he said. 26 episodes. Guaranteed. The number on the check was rumored to be $100 million. The industry gasped. It was a staggering amount of money for a company that was still recovering from the Quickster disaster, a company whose stock was still bruised. It was a bet the company move. If the show flopped, Netflix would be the laughingstock of Hollywood, the tech nerds with more money than sense, fleeced by the savvy producers. But the deal was signed. The production began. The making of House of Cards was defined by a terrifying freedom. Usually, when a network spends $100 million, they send a minder. They send executives to the set to watch the dailies, to critique the costumes, to worry about the tone. Is the main character too unlikable? Will he alienate the advertisers? But Netflix had no advertisers to alienate. They weren't selling soap or cars. They were selling a subscription. They didn't need the character to be nice. They needed him to be compelling. They gave Fincher total control. We hired you because you know what you're doing, was the message, so go do it. The show that emerged was cold, metallic, and beautiful. It was shot in a palette of slate grays, deep blues, and shadows. It had the aesthetic of a Shark Tank. It was a reflection of the company's new identity, sharp, serious, and unafraid of the dark. But the innovation wasn't just in the production, it was in the delivery. For 60 years, television had been defined by the weekly schedule. A show aired on Tuesday at 9 p.m. If you missed it, you missed it. Even with DVRs, the cultural rhythm was weekly. The cliffhanger was designed to hook you, to make you wait, to keep you paying the cable bill for another month. The engineers and the executives looked at the data again. They saw how people watched old shows on the service. They saw Breaking Bad and Mad Men being consumed in massive gluttonous chunks. People didn't watch 1 episode and stop. They watched 3. They watched 5. They realized that the weekly release schedule was not a creative choice. It was a relic of the advertising model. It was designed to drag out the audience so commercials could be sold over months. Netflix didn't need to sell commercials. They needed to create an event. They decided to do the unthinkable. They would release all 13 episodes of the first season at the exact same second. February 1st, 2013. The launch was silent in the physical world, but deafening in the digital one. At midnight, a switch was flipped in the server rooms. The files propagated to the content delivery network. On millions of screens, the interface updated. A new image appeared. Kevin Spacey, sitting on a stone throne, his hands bloody. House of Cards, Season 1, now streaming. There was no tune in next week. It was just there, a 13-hour movie, a novel delivered in a single volume. The reaction was a mixture of confusion and ecstasy. Critics didn't know how to review it. Do we review the first episode, the whole thing? Viewers didn't know how to pace themselves. The binge was born. Of course, people had binged on DVD box sets before, but that required buying the box, changing the discs, the physical friction. This was frictionless. As soon as the credits rolled on Chapter 1, a small counter appeared in the corner of the screen. Next episode playing in 15 seconds. It was the most addictive feature ever built into a television interface. It removed the decision to continue, to stop watching. You had to actively reach for the remote and press a button. If you did nothing, the stream carried you forward. That weekend, a strange phenomenon occurred. People disappeared. They went into their living rooms on Friday night and didn't emerge until Sunday. Social media filled with the collective hallucination of a shared marathon. I'm on episode 8, I'm on episode 11, don't spoil the end. It was a cultural earthquake. The show itself was a hit. It was sharp, well-written, and acted with ferocious intensity. But the medium was the message. The fact that it was on Netflix, that it was an original, changed the perception of the brand instantly. Before that Friday, Netflix was a library. It was a place you went to find old movies. It was a utility, like the water company. After that Friday, Netflix was a channel. It was HBO. It was a destination. The original label became a stamp of quality. It signaled that Netflix wasn't just recycling culture, it was creating it. The gamble paid off. The subscriber numbers spiked. The stock price began to climb again, shaking off the ghost of Quickster. The industry, which had sneered at the tech guys, suddenly went quiet. They realized that the balance of power had shifted. The tenant had just bought the building. But there was a deeper psychological shift happening, one that went beyond business models. House of Cards was a show about power, manipulation, and the cold calculus of ambition. In many ways, it was a mirror of the company that commissioned it. Netflix had used data to reverse engineer art. They had deconstructed the creative process into a series of probabilities and bets. To the purists, this was horrifying. It was the death of the auteur, the rise of the machine-made story. But to the viewer, it felt like magic. It felt like the television finally understood them. The success of House of Cards emboldened the company. They didn't stop. They doubled down. They looked at the data again. They saw an audience for women's prison dramas. Orange is the New Black. They saw an audience for 1980s nostalgia, Stranger Things. They began to spend billions. The burn rate that had terrified them in the early days became a badge of honor. They were spending money to buy time, to buy loyalty, to build a moat of content so deep and wide that no competitor could cross it. The glass fortress of the old studios was still standing, but the ground underneath it was liquefying. The executives who had demanded pilots and weekly schedules looked out their windows and saw a world that had moved on. They had been playing poker. Netflix was playing 3D chess, and the pieces were moving at the speed of light. And in the center of it all was the viewer, sitting on the couch, remote in hand, bathed in the blue light of the screen. The credits rolled. The countdown began. 15, 14, 13. The choice to stop was gone. The story wasn't just something you watched, it was something that consumed you. The era of appointment television was dead. The era of the infinite stream had arrived. Chapter 11, The Death of the Cliffhanger. Time is a liquid. It takes the shape of the container into which it is poured. For nearly a century, the container of television was rigid. It was a grid of 30-minute and 60-minute blocks, carved up by advertisers and station managers. The rhythm of a story was dictated by the clock on the wall. A drama had to peak at 12 minutes to allow for a car commercial. It had to resolve at 58 minutes to allow for the news. And it had to end with a question mark, a cliffhanger, to ensure that the viewer would return after the long, silent gap of a week. This structure created a specific texture to human life. It created the water cooler moment. You watched Lost or The Sopranos on Sunday night, and on Monday morning you stood in the office break room and dissected it. You shared theories. You lived in the gap between episodes. The gap was where the imagination worked. It was where the anticipation lived. But in 2013, the container shattered. Netflix had introduced the all-at-once release strategy with House of Cards, but as the library of original content grew, Orange is the New Black, Stranger Things, Narcos, the behavioral shift solidified into something permanent. They didn't just change the delivery method, they changed the physics of consumption. They invented the binge. Let us observe the anatomy of this new addiction. It begins with a small piece of user interface design, a feature so subtle that most people never noticed when it was introduced, yet so powerful it fundamentally altered global sleep patterns. The post-play feature. In the old world of the DVD, when a movie ended, the screen went black, the credits rolled in silence, the machine stopped. To watch something else, you had to perform a series of physical actions. Find the remote, stand up, open the tray, swap the disc, press play. There were 5 or 6 off-ramps moments where your brain could say, I should go to bed. I should do the dishes. The streaming engineers looked at these off-ramps and saw them as flaws. They saw them as friction. They built a bridge. Now, as the final scene of an episode fades, the credits are squeezed into a small box in the corner. The screen does not go black. Instead, a new image appears, the opening frame of the next chapter, and in the bottom right, a small white circle begins to fill, ticking down like a bomb timer. Next episode playing in 15, 14, 13. It is a masterpiece of behavioral psychology. It inverts the default choice. In the past, the default was stop. You had to choose to continue. Now the default is continue. You have to choose to stop. If you do nothing, if you are paralyzed by fatigue or laziness or simple inertia, the stream carries you forward. The river flows. The decision is made for you. This feature, combined with the release of entire seasons at once, created a new state of being. Consider the experience of the binge. It is distinct from watching a marathon on cable TV. A cable marathon is passive. You join a stream that is already flowing. A Netflix binge is active, intentional immersion. It usually begins on a Friday evening. The viewer enters the story. They watch episode 1. It is the hook. They watch episode 2. The world builds. They watch episode 3. And then a strange phenomenon occurs. The outside world begins to dissolve. The sun goes down. The room gets dark. The blue light of the television becomes the only illumination, flickering against the walls like a campfire in a cave. The phone is ignored. The text messages pile up. The body settles into the couch, entering a state of suspended animation. Hours pass. The brain enters a flow state. Because there are no commercials, the spell is never broken. There is no jingle for toothpaste to snap you back to reality. The narrative is continuous. The emotional arc of the characters becomes your emotional arc. You are not just watching the prison in Orange is the New Black. You are in the prison. You are serving time. There is a specific feeling that comes around the 4th or 5th hour. It is a feeling of density. The characters feel like family. You know their faces better than you know your neighbors. You are living a compressed lifetime with them. Midnight comes and goes. The post-play timer ticks down. 5, 4, 3. Just one more, the viewer whispers. It is the lie of the addict. The writers, freed from the constraints of the network clock, began to write differently. They stopped writing episodes and started writing chapters. In network TV, every episode needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. It needs to recap what happened last week, previously on. It needs to reintroduce the plot for the casual viewer. But the Netflix writer knows you just watched the previous episode 30 seconds ago. They know you don't need a recap, they know you don't need a resolution, so the story becomes a long, slow burn. A 10-hour movie cut into slices, the pacing slows down. They can spend an entire episode on a character's backstory, or a silent journey, or a mood. They don't have to fight for your attention every 7 minutes, because they already have it. This led to the golden age of serialized drama, but it also led to the death of the cliffhanger as we knew it. The cliffhanger used to be a question that hung in the air for 7 days. Who shot JR? Is he dead? Now the cliffhanger is a speed bump. It is a momentary pause. The question is answered in 10 seconds. The tension is raised and released in a rhythmic, hypnotic cycle. By 3 a.m., the viewer is in a trance. The eyes are dry, the limbs are stiff. The pizza box on the coffee table is empty. The concept of Saturday is theoretical. There is only the stream. And then the screen goes black. Season finale. The spell breaks. The silence rushes back into the room. The reflection in the dark glass of the TV stares back. A pale, exhausted ghost. This is the binge hangover. It is a sense of profound disorientation. You have just spent 12 hours in 1980s Indiana, or in the drug wars of Colombia, or in the political intrigue of Washington, D.C. You step outside, and the sunlight hurts. The real world feels thin, colorless, and boring compared to the high-saturation drama you just left. There is also a sense of loss. You have consumed the meal too fast. You have gorged. The story that took a year to film, the story that could have sustained you for months of weekly viewing, is gone in a weekend. And now, the wait begins. Not a week, but a year. The gap has moved from between episodes to between seasons. The death of the cliffhanger also killed the water cooler. The shared cultural moment was shattered by the asynchronous nature of streaming. In the office on Monday morning, the conversation changed. It became a minefield of spoilers. Did you see Stranger Things? I'm only on episode 4. Okay, stop, don't say anything. I finished it last night. Whoa, slow down. We were no longer experiencing culture together. We were experiencing it alone, at our own speeds. The water cooler became a race. To be part of the conversation, you had to finish first. If you didn't binge the show on the opening weekend, you had to exile yourself from social media to avoid the spoilers. The internet became a dangerous place for the slow watcher. Twitter was a stream of revelations. Headlines shouted plot twists. This pressure to consume quickly changed the nature of leisure. Watching TV stopped being a way to relax and started feeling like homework. You had to keep up. You had to watch the new show that everyone was talking about, and you had to do it now, before the memes spoiled the ending. The company, of course, loved this. The data showed that binge watchers were stickier. Once you were in the ecosystem, once you had invested 12 hours of your life into a show, you weren't going to cancel the subscription. You were hooked. Netflix began to engineer its shows for the binge. They analyzed the completion rate. If people stopped watching at episode 3, that was a failure. The algorithm learned what kept people glued to the screen. It learned the perfect length of a pre-credit sequence. It learned exactly where to place the twist. They weren't just making art, they were refining a drug. But there were voices of dissent. Some critics argued that something vital had been lost. They argued that the gap was necessary for art to settle. When you wait a week for the next episode, the story marinates in your mind. You think about the themes. You live with the characters. You appreciate the craft. When you binge, the story washes over you like a fire hose. You remember the plot, but you might miss the nuance. It becomes a blur of sensation. You consume it, digest it, and excrete it, ready for the next meal. It is the difference between a 7-course tasting menu served over 3 hours and eating all 7 courses in a single bucket in 20 minutes. The calories are the same, but the experience is different. Yet the shift was irreversible. The human brain, presented with the option of wait or now, will almost always choose now. We are creatures of instant gratification. The subscription model and the streaming technology had simply unlocked a desire that had always been there. We never wanted to wait a week. We were just forced to. The death of the cliffhanger was the death of patience. It rippled out beyond Netflix. Amazon, Hulu, HBO, they all had to adapt. Even the linear networks began to offer stacking rights, allowing viewers to catch up on demand. The entire industry bent the knee to the binge. Let us return to the living room late at night. The viewer is asleep on the couch. The TV is still glowing. Finally, the machine intervenes. It has a conscience, or at least a bandwidth-saving protocol. A prompt appears on the screen, silent and judgmental. Are you still watching? It is the only check on the system. It is the machine asking the human, are you sure you want to do this? Are you still conscious? Have you had enough? The viewer stirs. They blink against the light. They see the prompt. They have a choice. They can turn it off. They can go to bed. They can reclaim their time. But the remote is right there. The story is unresolved. The cliffhanger, or what's left of it, is beckoning. The thumb moves. The button clicks. Continue watching. The prompt vanishes. The wheel spins. The stream resumes. The night is long and the library is infinite. The cliffhanger is dead, but the story never ends. It just flows, on and on. A river of light in the darkness, carrying us gently away from the real world, one episode at a time. Chapter 12, The Global Village. The world is a Babel. It is a fractured mosaic of 6,000 languages split by time zones, borders, and oceans. For most of human history, culture has been local. A story told in a village in Bavaria stayed in Bavaria. A joke cracked in Tokyo made no sense in Toronto. The friction of geography and the wall of language kept our narratives contained, like fires burning in separate caves. To be an American media company was usually to be an exporter of a specific kind of monoculture. You made Friends or Baywatch in Los Angeles, you dubbed it into bad German or Spanish, and you shipped it out. You expected the world to come to you. You expected the world to want to be American. But Netflix had conquered America. By 2015, the red envelope and the red progress bar were ubiquitous in the United States. The growth curve, once vertical, was beginning to flatten. To keep the engine running, to satisfy the insatiable hunger of the stock market, the company had to look at the map. They saw the vast, dark spaces where the screen was not yet lit. They decided to do something that had never been done in the history of commerce. Usually, a company expands slowly. You open in the UK. You wait a year. You open in France. You hire lawyers, you negotiate rights, you learn the local taste. It is a slow, creeping colonization. Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos looked at the map and decided to ignore the borders. They decided to flip the switch for the entire planet at once. The moment happened in Las Vegas, at the Consumer Electronics Show in January 2016. It was a keynote speech, usually the venue for announcing a thinner television or a faster processor. Reed stood on stage. Behind him was a massive map of the world. Right now, he said, Netflix is live-in. He began to list the countries: Azerbaijan, Vietnam, Nigeria, Poland, Saudi Arabia. As he spoke, the map behind him began to light up. The gray turned to red. It wasn't a slow creep, it was a flood. In the span of a few seconds, 130 countries were brought online. It was a piece of theater, yes, but it masked a logistical miracle. In server farms from Singapore to Frankfurt, engineers were routing traffic, opening floodgates, and synchronizing libraries. The Great Firewall of China remained dark, as did the sanctioned outposts of Crimea, North Korea, and Syria. But everywhere else, the signal was live. The audacious claim was that Netflix was no longer an American television network, it was the first global television network. But technology is easy. Culture is hard. Turning on the server is one thing. Convincing a grandmother in Mumbai to pay a monthly fee for a service full of American stand-up comedy is another. The challenge was the 1-inch-tall barrier. This was the famous phrase used by director Bong Joon-ho to describe subtitles. For decades, the conventional wisdom in Hollywood was that Americans would not read. If a movie wasn't in English, it was art house. It was spinach. It belonged in a dusty theater in New York, not in the multiplex. And conversely, the world was tired of American cultural imperialism. They wanted to see themselves. Netflix realized that to be truly global, they couldn't just export Hollywood. They had to import the world. They had to find the storytellers in Bogota, in Seoul, in Berlin, in Mumbai, and give them the same budget and freedom they gave David Fincher. The first great test of this theory was a show about a drug lord. Narcos was a strange hybrid. It was produced by a French studio. It was shot in Colombia. It starred a Brazilian actor playing a Colombian criminal, and it was spoken in a mix of English and Spanish. In the old world, a network executive would have panicked. Make them speak English, they would have said, or dub it. The audience won't follow the subtitles. Netflix looked at the data. They trusted the intelligence of the viewer. They released it raw. The result was a revelation. It turned out that authenticity was more important than convenience. Hearing the jagged, fast-paced Spanish slang, seeing the sweat and the rain of Medellin, reading the white text at the bottom of the screen, it made the experience immersive. It felt real. Narcos became a hit not just in Latin America, but in Germany, in the US, in Japan. It proved that a story didn't have to be in English to be universal. It just had to be good. This sparked a gold rush of local production. We travel now to a soundproof room in Berlin. It is dark. A German actor stands in front of a microphone watching a screen. On the screen, an American actor is moving his lips. This is the invisible art of localization. Netflix began to build a massive infrastructure of translation. They weren't just slapping text on the screen. They were hiring armies of translators, dubbing directors, and voice actors. They treated dubbing not as an afterthought, but as a performance. They developed technology to help. They created tools where translators could see the audio waveforms, ensuring that the German word for run fit into the exact same split-second gap as the English word. They were building the Tower of Babel in reverse. They were creating a system where any story could flow into any language instantly. And then, the flow reversed. For a century, the current of culture had flowed from west to east. Hollywood made the movies, and the world watched. But then came Dark, a German sci-fi thriller about time travel and nuclear power plants. It was complex, moody, and deeply German. It became a global phenomenon. Then came La Casa de Papel, Money Heist from Spain. It was a show that had actually flopped on Spanish television. It was canceled. Netflix bought the rights for pennies, put it on the global platform, and did almost no marketing. The algorithm did the rest. It found the people who liked heist movies. It suggested the show to a viewer in Turkey, then a viewer in Brazil, then a viewer in France. Suddenly, people in red jumpsuits and Salvador Dali masks were appearing in protests around the world. The show became the most watched non-English series in history at the time. It was a hit that Hollywood didn't see coming because Hollywood wasn't looking at Spain. But the true earthquake arrived from the East. South Korea had been building a cultural powerhouse for decades, K-pop, K-drama, but it was still considered a genre. It was a niche. Then came the green tracksuits. Squid Game was a script that had been rejected for 10 years. It was too violent, too weird. A critique of capitalism involving children's games? No studio wanted it. Netflix said yes. They said yes because their Korean team, on the ground in Seoul, said, "This feels like the moment." When Squid Game dropped in 2021, it didn't just perform well, it consumed the planet. It was the first truly global water cooler moment. Imagine the scene. It is a Tuesday. In a high-rise apartment in New York, a stockbroker is watching desperate people play red light, green light. In a cafe in Paris, students are debating the morality of the marble game. In a living room in Lagos, a family is gasping at the tug-of-war. They're all watching it at the same time, they're all watching it on the same interface, and, crucially, they are all feeling the same tension. The language barrier had dissolved. The subtitles were just part of the aesthetic. The emotions, greed, fear, desperation, love, were the universal language. The success of Squid Game shattered the last vestige of American arrogance. It proved that the next Star Wars or Harry Potter didn't have to come from the Anglosphere. It could come from anywhere. This expansion changed the texture of the Netflix library. If you scrolled through the menu in 2012, it was a list of Hollywood movies. If you scrolled through the menu in 2022, it was a travelogue. Turkish soap operas, Indian gangster epics, Japanese anime, Scandinavian noir. The foreign language section disappeared. It was just drama. It was just comedy. The algorithm stopped caring about the country of origin. It realized that a fan of gritty crime dramas might like The Wire, USA, and Gomorrah, Italy equally. It began to mix the DNA of global culture. This had a profound psychological effect on the viewer. We began to get used to the sound of other languages in our living rooms. We began to recognize the streets of Seoul or the architecture of Madrid as familiar backdrops. The world shrank, but this global expansion also brought new perils. When you operate in 190 countries, you are subject to 190 sets of laws. You are subject to 190 different cultural sensitivities. In Saudi Arabia, an episode of a comedy show criticizing the crown prince was ordered to be removed. Netflix complied. In India, scenes involving religion sparked protests and legal threats. In Russia, new laws about propaganda forced uncomfortable choices before the eventual suspension of service due to the war. Netflix found itself acting not just as a TV station, but as a diplomat. They had to navigate censorship, government demands, and the shifting sands of geopolitics. They learned that the internet might be borderless, but the governments that control the pipes are not. They also faced the backlash of the local industries. In France, the cinema purists revolted. They demanded that Netflix be banned from the Cannes Film Festival because their movies didn't play in theaters. It was a clash of philosophies, the sacred cathedral of the cinema versus the profane convenience of the stream. Netflix didn't back down. They argued that the screen size didn't matter. The art was the art. As the sun sets on this chapter, we look at the globe from the perspective of the server. It is night. The traffic is spiking. In Europe, people are finishing dinner and turning on The Crown. In the Americas, people are getting home from work and turning on Stranger Things. In Asia, people are waking up or commuting, watching K-dramas on their phones on the subway. The red envelope, which started as a physical object traveling the roads of California, has become a pulse of light encircling the Earth. The company has built a nervous system for humanity. It is a shared dream state. For a few hours every day, millions of human beings, separated by thousands of miles and vastly different lives, effectively hallucinate the same story together. The village has become global. The fire around which we gather is now digital, and it burns in every language. But as the company conquered the world, a new threat was rising back home. The landlords, who had been watching the tenant build this massive global empire, finally decided they had had enough. They were done renting. They were coming to take their content back. The streaming wars were about to begin. The Plus era was coming. Chapter 13, The War for the Soul of Cinema. There's a specific kind of silence that exists inside a movie theater. It is not an empty silence. It is a charged, collective hush. It is the sound of 300 strangers agreeing to suspend their disbelief at the exact same moment. The lights dim. The velvet curtains part. The projector beam cuts through the dust motes like a solid bar of light. And for 2 hours, the outside world ceases to exist. You cannot pause. You cannot check your phone. You are a captive of the dream. For 100 years, this ritual was the only way to validate a motion picture. If it didn't play on the big screen, it wasn't a movie. It was television, it was video, it was something lesser. By 2018, Netflix had money, it had subscribers, it had global reach. But it did not have the one thing that money cannot buy. It did not have the blessing of the church. It wanted a gold statue. The Academy Awards, the Oscars, are the high mass of the film industry. They are a ceremony of tradition, a fortress built to protect the sanctity of the theatrical experience. Netflix had broken down the walls of the video store, but the doors of the Dolby Theater remained locked. To the guardians of cinema, the directors, the producers, the theater owners, Netflix was the barbarian at the gate. It was the entity that was turning their art form into content. It was reducing the majesty of Lawrence of Arabia to a thumbnail on an iPad. Reed Hastings and Ted Sarandos knew that to win the war, they couldn't just be a tech company. They had to prove they were artists. They had to make a movie that was undeniably cinema, even if it was destined for the stream. The battlefield shifted to the south of France. The Cannes Film Festival is the most prestigious film festival in the world. It is a place of aggressive glamour, where the red carpet is treated like holy ground, and the audience is known to boo films they dislike with a passionate, uniquely French ferocity. In 2017, Netflix brought 2 films to the competition. As the red N logo appeared on the massive screen of the Grand Théâtre Lumière, a hiss went through the crowd. It was a visceral sound. It was the sound of an immune system reacting to a virus. The French theater owners were furious. French law dictated a long window, months, sometimes years, between a film's theatrical release and its appearance on streaming. Netflix refused to wait. They wanted the film to be available to their subscribers immediately. The clash was philosophical. The festival argued that a movie exists only when it is projected in a dark room. Netflix argued that a movie exists wherever the viewer is. The result was an exile. The festival changed its rules. No film could compete for the Palme d'Or unless it had a theatrical release in France. Netflix was effectively banned. It was a public rejection. The establishment had drawn a line in the sand. You can have the money, they said, but you cannot have the prestige. Netflix responded not with anger, but with a checkbook. If the festivals wouldn't accept them, they would buy the talent that the festivals worshipped. They would become the patron saints of the auteurs. Enter Alfonso Cuarón. Cuarón was a master, the director of Gravity and Children of Men. He had a deeply personal project he wanted to make. It was a black-and-white memoir of his childhood in Mexico City. It was called Roma. It was not a commercial movie. It had no stars. It was spoken in Spanish and Mixtec. It was slow, meditative, and visually stunning. No traditional Hollywood studio wanted to fund it. The marketing math didn't work. Who would buy a ticket to see a black-and-white art film in a multiplex dominated by superheroes? Netflix stepped in. They didn't care about the box office. They cared about the art. They gave Cuarón the money. And more importantly, they promised him the widest audience in history. But there was a catch. Most people would watch this masterpiece, with its intricate sound design and 65mm cinematography, on a television, or a laptop, or, God forbid, a phone. This is the central paradox of the Netflix era of cinema. They are the only ones willing to pay for real cinema, but their delivery method arguably diminishes it. The campaign for Roma was a military operation. Netflix spent millions on billboards, parties, and for your consideration ads. They booked theaters, renting them out just to satisfy the Academy's rules, so the film could technically be called a theatrical release. It worked, to a degree. Roma won Best Director. But it lost Best Picture to Green Book, a traditional, crowd-pleasing studio movie. The industry had held the line. They had given the streamer a pat on the head, but not the crown. Then came The Irishman. If Roma was the art house skirmish, The Irishman was the heavy artillery. Martin Scorsese is the living embodiment of American cinema. He is the high priest. For years, he had been trying to make a film about the end of the mob, reuniting Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci. But the film had a problem. It spanned decades. It required the actors to play men in their 30s, their 50s, and their 80s. Scorsese didn't want to use different actors. He wanted to use technology. He wanted to de-age his stars using experimental, expensive computer graphics. The budget ballooned to $160 million. Paramount Pictures, Scorsese's longtime home, looked at the price tag and blinked. A 3.5-hour gangster movie starring men in their 70s costing as much as a Marvel movie? It was a financial death wish. The studio said no. The guardians of cinema said it was too risky. So Martin Scorsese, the defender of the theatrical experience, turned to the algorithm. Netflix wrote the check without blinking. There is a profound irony here. The traditional studios, driven by the need for box office returns, had abandoned adult drama for safer franchise bets. Netflix, the destroyer of the video store, became the savior of the mid-budget drama. They became the Medicis of the digital age. The release of The Irishman in late 2019 was a cultural event, but it was a melancholy one. The film is a masterpiece of regret. It is about men looking back at their lives and realizing they are ashes. It is slow. It is quiet. It is designed to be absorbed in a dark room, with no distractions. But that is not how it was consumed. Let us visualize the viewing experience. It is a Wednesday night. A couple sits on a sofa. They start the movie. The technology works. De Niro looks young again. The illusion is seamless. The story draws them in. But 90 minutes in, life intrudes. The bladder calls. The phone buzzes. In a theater, you hold it. You endure. The film dictates the time. At home, you press a button. Pause. The image freezes. The spell breaks. The characters are suspended in digital amber. The viewer goes to the kitchen, gets a glass of water, checks Twitter. It's a great movie, they tweet, but it's long. They return to the sofa. They press play. The momentum has to be rebuilt. Some viewers didn't finish it in one sitting. They watched it as a miniseries. They watched an hour on Tuesday, an hour on Wednesday, an hour on Thursday. Scorsese begged people not to watch it on their phones. Please, he said in interviews, don't watch it on an iPhone. He knew that on a small screen the composition is lost. The grandeur is lost. The face of Al Pacino shouting becomes the size of a postage stamp. But the viewer is sovereign. The viewer does not care about the director's intent. The viewer cares about the train ride home. The backlash from the old guard was fierce. Steven Spielberg, the most successful director in history, spoke out. He argued that once you commit to a television format, you are a TV movie. You deserve an Emmy, not an Oscar. He championed the theatrical window, the sacred 90 days of exclusivity that theaters demanded. He argued that the communal experience, the act of leaving your house and sitting with strangers, was vital to the health of society. And he was right. There is a magic in the crowd. The collective gasp. The shared laughter that ripples through the room, making the joke funnier than it would be alone. But he was fighting a tide that had already turned. The theaters were becoming theme parks. They were for superheroes, dinosaurs, and avatars. They were for loud, sensory spectacles. The quiet human dramas, the Kramer versus Kramers, the Godfathers, were disappearing from the multiplex. Netflix argued that they weren't killing cinema, they were preserving it. They were giving these stories a home. They were putting The Irishman in front of 150 million people instantly. More people watched Scorsese's film in the first week on Netflix than would have watched it in a year of theatrical release. Was it better to be seen by millions on a phone or by thousands on a big screen? This was the war for the soul of the medium. Was cinema defined by the room or by the light? And then the debate was rendered moot by a force of nature. The year turned to 2020. A virus emerged. The theaters closed. The lights went out in the Dolby Theater and the Grand Theatre Lumiere in the multiplex at the mall. The popcorn went stale. The projectors grew cold. The world went inside. Suddenly, the living room wasn't just an alternative. It was the only option. The argument about the sanctity of the theatrical window evaporated because there were no theaters. Netflix was no longer the barbarian, it was the lifeline. It was the only way to see a new movie. It was the only way to escape the confinement of the lockdown. During those long, gray months of isolation, the streaming service became the central hearth of civilization. We watched Tiger King together, apart. We watched The Queen's Gambit. The Academy Awards eventually acquiesced. They changed the rules, temporarily, to allow streaming films to compete. They had no choice. The war ended not with a treaty, but with a surrender to reality. The communal experience of the dark room will never truly die. Humans crave the gathering. But the monopoly of the theater is broken forever. We have entered a new era of the image. It is an era where the screen is personal, intimate, and always on. The cinema has become content. It is a victory for access. A kid in a rural village can watch the same masterpiece as a critic in New York. The library is open to all. But as the credits roll on The Irishman, and the algorithm suggests a baking show next, there is a lingering sense of loss. We have gained the world, but we have lost the hush. We have lost the darkness. We have lost the feeling of being small in the presence of something huge. The projector beam has been replaced by the pixel, and the silence of the theater has been replaced by the notification chime. Chapter 14, The Infinite Scroll. The sound is less than 3 seconds long. It is a deep, resonant thud, followed by a swelling digital chime. Tudum. It is perhaps the most recognizable sound in the modern world. It is heard in penthouses, in Manhattan, in favelas, in Rio, in high-rise apartments in Tokyo, and in suburban bedrooms in Ohio. It is the sound of a portal opening. It is the sound of the transition from the friction of the real world into the frictionless expanse of the digital one. We have arrived at the present day. The war is over. The video stores are gone, their buildings turned into mattress shops and urgent care clinics. The red envelopes are gone, the final disc mailed as a ceremonial relic. The resistance of the cinema chains has broken. They have accepted their role as museums for the blockbuster. Netflix is no longer a disruptor. It is the atmosphere. It is the background radiation of our leisure time. But victory brings its own quiet crisis. When you have conquered the world, when you have eliminated all the barriers to consumption, you are left with the final, insurmountable obstacle, the human mind. Let us observe the modern ritual of the evening. A viewer sits down, they are tired, the day has been a barrage of notifications, emails, and demands. They pick up the remote, they summon the interface. Tudum. The screen fills with a mosaic of choice. It is a masterpiece of design. Rows of colorful tiles, stretching infinitely to the right, stacking infinitely downward. Trending now. Because you watched. Top 10 in your country. Critically acclaimed dramas. The images are vibrant. They are optimized. The algorithm selects the specific thumbnail that is most likely to appeal to this specific viewer's psychology. If you like romance, the thumbnail for a generic action movie will show the two leads looking at each other. If you like violence, the same movie will show a car exploding. The viewer presses the button, the carousel moves. Click, click, click. This is the infinite scroll. It is a state of motion without progress. The viewer scrolls past a comedy. Maybe. They scroll past a documentary about fungus. Too heavy. They scroll past a dystopian sci-fi series. Seen it. They scroll past a 90s classic. Not in the mood. 5 minutes pass. 10 minutes. The dinner on the table is getting cold. This is the paralysis of abundance. In the era of the video store, you walked the aisles, picked a tape, and committed. The physical act forced a choice. But here, in the digital ether, the cost of choosing wrong feels oddly high. There is always something better, just one click away. The fear of missing out on the perfect option prevents us from enjoying the good option. The abundance has created a strange kind of poverty. We are starving in a supermarket. Finally, defeated by the sheer weight of the library, the viewer makes the default choice. They click on The Office, or Friends, or Grey's Anatomy. They choose the comfort watch. They choose the show they have seen a dozen times before. They choose it because it demands nothing from them. It is audiovisual wallpaper. It is a warm bath for the brain. The algorithm watches this happen. It records the failure to explore. It narrows the world a little bit more. Okay, it thinks. They want safety. I will give them more safety. This is the final transformation of the medium. Netflix began as a way to access cinema, those singular, contained works of art that demanded your full attention. But in the era of the scroll, it has become a machine for generating content. Content is different from art. Art challenges. Art asks questions. Content fills space. Content is designed to be consumed while looking at your phone. Content is designed to be bingeable, smooth, and unobtrusive. We see the rise of ambient TV, shows about organizing closets, shows about baking cakes, shows about blowing glass. Reality shows where people live in pods and fall in love without seeing each other. These are not stories in the traditional sense. They are textures. They are designed to soothe the anxiety of modern life. They are digital fireplaces. The company that commissioned The Irishman and Roma also commissions Is It Cake? They have to. They are no longer a curator. They are a utility. They must provide water for every kind of thirst. They must be the highbrow cinema and the trashy tabloid. They must be everything to everyone all the time. And yet, in the middle of this ocean of content, the ghost of the connection remains. Sometimes the algorithm gets it right. Sometimes you click on a tile you've never seen, and you are transported. You find a story from a culture you don't understand, told in a language you don't speak, and for 6 hours you are lifted out of your life. This is the enduring miracle of the red envelope, digitized. When Squid Game swept the world, or when Wednesday sparked a viral dance craze, it proved that the monoculture isn't dead. It just moves faster now. We can still dream the same dream, we just do it in bursts. The global village is a chaotic, noisy place, but it is connected. A teenager in Brazil and a teenager in South Korea can share a reference, a meme, a feeling, instantly. The wires that Reed Hastings bet on in 2007 have knitted the consciousness of the planet together in a way that is historically unprecedented. The story of Netflix is the story of the dissolution of the physical world. It started with a plastic cassette in a car, heavy with the shame of a late fee. It moved to a shiny disc in a paper envelope, traveling the physical roads. It dissolved into a digital file, squeezed through a copper wire. And finally, it became a stream of light, beaming invisibly through the air to a slab of glass in our hands. The friction is gone. The weight is gone. But what remains is the viewer. Let us end where we began, in the quiet of a room. It is late. The house is dark. The blue light of the television washes over the furniture, casting long, shifting shadows. The rest of the world is asleep. The viewer is alone. They have watched 4 episodes. The time has dissolved. The real world, the job, the bills, the worries, has been held at bay for 3 hours. The episode ends. The credits shrink to the corner. The timer begins its countdown. 15, 14, 13. The viewer stares at the screen. They are at the edge of the cliff. To stop is to return to reality. To stop is to acknowledge the loneliness, the silence, the impending mourning. To continue is to float. The machine waits. It is patient. It does not judge. It only serves. Then the prompt appears, soft and dark against the black background. Are you still watching? It is the defining question of our age. It asks if we are still present. It asks if we are still conscious. It asks if we are still hungry for the story, or if we are just afraid of the dark. The viewer reaches for the remote. The plastic is warm in their hand. They look at the question. Are you still watching? They press the button. Yes. The wheel spins. The light flares. The story continues. And the scroll goes on, infinite and eternal, into the night.